Hello, everyone. It's time for another live stream. And today we're going to look at a video that Braxton from Trinity Radio put up a couple of days ago. And when I saw this, I kind of knew that I would just sort of have to respond to it. And then I thought, I don't need to do that. I can do other things. But then I thought, no, actually, I can't help myself. It's going to be bad, and I should respond to it. Now, in some sense, that's unfair, right? Because I should judge a video on its content, not based on preconceptions or thumbnails. But I watched it and it's bad, so I'm going to talk about it. So this is the video that I'm talking about here. Let's make it a bit bigger here. Why God Explains Consciousness is the title. What I didn't realize at first is that this is actually a sermon. I guess you would call this a sermon. It's presented at a church. The church is called, it mentions it in the comments here, or the description rather, One Life Church. Or the network, maybe it's multiple churches. I'm not really sure. But they've got quite a slick production there, which you'll sort of see throughout this. Anyway, so I'll call it a sermon. The sermon that Braxton is giving is about this issue of God and consciousness. And it's quite interesting, actually. It's sort of a little introduction to some aspects of philosophy of mind presented to what I assume is a Christian worship audience, presumably fairly large. We don't see the crowd, and it's interspersed by these this kind of rock music and these pretty slick visuals, which it's bizarre. I've never been to anything like this myself. Maybe others wouldn't find it bizarre. I don't know. I find it a little odd. But anyway, so I suppose at the outset, it's important to note that, welcome everyone as they come in, by the way. It's important to note that because this is a sermon and because it's presented to a popular audience, I'm not expecting it to be, extremely rigorous or use a lot of technical jargon. That would be, I think, unreasonable. But the argument still should be good, right? I mean, just because it's to a popular or wider audience doesn't mean that the arguments can be lousy or invalid or not looking at alternate views or straw manning and that sort of thing. So I will be critiquing that. And having watched it through, I think that the arguments are just terrible, and that he does straw man alternate views quite a lot, and that the fundamental premise of this, which is that God explains consciousness, which he does, isn't just a thumbnail. Sorry, it's not just a title. He actually does effectively say that. I don't know if he says literally those words in the video, but that is his thesis. He doesn't even come close, in my opinion, to establishing that. So that's the let's see, that's my initial remarks. Yeah, let's make a start and have a look at this.
They're amazing if you feel about it like we do in our family.
Oh yeah, so I think I've skipped a little bit of the intro bit here, but I just want to focus on sort of the main argument that he's making. So it should become clear what he's talking about here.
Blown away that these artificial intelligences and robots exist on the one hand, but then on the other hand, they're really frustrating because if you asked it this morning, hey, how do I get to One Life East? Maybe it told you, or maybe it said, I don't know, but here's a website, you can read about it on your own. Thanks. Well, why is that? It's because these things aren't conscious like a human being is conscious. Siri, Alexa, Google Home, they don't have this first-person experience. You're not really interacting with a real person who's conscious. You're just interacting with pre-programmed responses. So we have those brains of a sort, the best we can do at coming up with a fake consciousness. Then on the other hand, there are some robots that you probably have some affinities for in a place like One Life and the people that might show up to church at a church like One Life. I would wager that some of you have some great feelings of love, admiration, or something toward one of these characters. Maybe not. We have Commander Data there, and Commander Data is on Star Trek, and one of his story arcs is he really wants to be a real boy, basically. He wants to have that conscious experience of the world, or he acts like he does, and he wants to have a human experience of the world. Then we have the robot from Lost in Space, and some of you may remember the robot from Lost in Space who's always worried about Will Robinson, right? And then we have C-3PO. Everybody knows C-3PO. And when we look at these characters, you probably feel as though you have more of a human connection with these particular robots. And the problem is, yeah, you do, but they're not real. You're not really connecting with robots. Those other things, those consumer products, those are real robots, and you're not connecting on a human level with them. But these robots that are fictional, we really believe them. When we watch them on screen, we think, Commander Data really is sad that he's not a real human being. We look at the robot from Lost in Space, and he's Will Robinson, and we really, really think he's consciously worried about Will Robinson. And C-3PO, when he says, we're doomed, we really think he's terrified. But the thing about it is, you're not really connecting with a robot when you're connecting with those fictional characters, are you? You're not connecting with C-3PO. You're connecting with this man. Anthony Daniels, the man who's inside of the suit, a real thinking conscious person. So all this talk about artificial intelligences and robots, we're going to come back to that later on. What I want you to realize right now is we've done the best we can so far and still not conscious. Most of them will tell you they're still not conscious if you ask them.
All right, let's pause there and just review a few things. Now, it occurs to me because I started the video by clicking this link here, which skips to when Braxton starts talking, and that appears to be when he starts. Well, now that I mention that, it seems that he's spoken a little bit before then. I'm just wondering because he doesn't appear to define consciousness, so that is one concern I have. Maybe I'll just skip back and check that. Why did they say it was 14 if it's actually 12? I trusted that link.
The people sitting around you or behind you, what you're going to do after you get done today, stop thinking about that. All of those things are possible because of this incredible ability to experience the world from a first-person perspective that we call your consciousness.
Okay.
That's what we're going to talk about today, and whether it provides evidence, good reason to believe that there is a God, that you are a soul, as the song just said, and all kinds of other things about the afterlife. And so as we talk about that, I want to set it up by picking up on something that Brett said a few moments ago, and that is really one of the big conversations we're having right now in the world is whether artificial intelligences and robots can ever become conscious. I want us to start there and think about this for just a moment as you begin to maybe toy around with the notion that maybe your consciousness and your brain aren't exactly the same thing, even if they're related. So on the screen right now, what you are going to see is you're going to see a number of consumer products that may be in your home or even in your pocket, depending.
All right, yeah. So he doesn't really define consciousness, but he does say that it's something about, I think he said first-person awareness. Let me actually make sure I get it exactly what he said there, because I don't want to straw man here.
The people sitting around you or behind you, what you're going to do after you get done today, stop thinking about that. All of those things are possible because of this incredible ability to experience the world from a first-person perspective.
Yeah, so first-person experience. So that's the way he's sort of conceptualizing consciousness there. Now, unsurprisingly, consciousness is the word is used in many different ways, both in real life and in philosophical life. Just having a bit of a browse through the Stanford Encyclopedia article on this, it mentions a number of different conceptions of consciousness. One is sort of wakefulness, of being the difference between being alert and asleep or unresponsive. That is clearly, I think, not the sense that's meant here, because in that sense, I mean, you can actually kind of talk about machines as being conscious, sort of in that sense, right? And certainly even fairly low forms of life can have differences between like sleep states and awake or alert states. So I don't think that's what's really meant here. That's the sense in which we say someone is conscious, they return to consciousness when they wake up from sleep. There's self-consciousness, which is sort of like a knowledge of the self and sort of self-awareness. So not all humans have that, like such as disabled persons or young children. And I don't think that's almost more related to intelligences and, I guess, self-reflection. So that's maybe part of it, but I don't think that's primarily what Braxton is talking about here. I think what he's talking about is what's sometimes talked about what it is like to be something. Thomas Nagel has talked about this in terms of what it is like to be a bat, his famous essay on this. Yet another conception of consciousness relates to the idea of intentionality. So being conscious of something. So I'm conscious of, the microphone in front of me and the lights in my room and other things like that. So that type of consciousness or that aspect of consciousness as an object. Whereas you can sort of think about consciousness in a more abstract way, that if you imagine, you go into sensory deprivation chamber and there's no sensory input and you sort of, I don't know, go in some sort of meditative state. You're not asleep, right? But you're not really thinking about anything. There's still some sort of underlying awareness there, or whatever you want to call that, that state. And maybe that's the sort of what it is like to be something, as distinct from being conscious of a particular percept or memory. I mean, these issues are complicated. All I'm doing is illustrating that the word consciousness is used in different ways. But the way I take Braxton to be using it here is essentially that it is like something to be a person, irrespective of what you're actually doing right now, or whether you're like, asleep. Well, I suppose if you're dreaming, it's still like something to be dreaming. If you're not dreaming, then maybe it isn't. But it's not so much about like self-consciousness or the intentionality of conscious states. Anyway, so just that's important to set aside at the outset, that we have some idea of what we're talking about. So what he then argues is that no machines that are currently extant have any of this sort of internal state where it's sort of like something to be that device. And I think that that's plausibly true, although it's interesting the results from the most recent survey of philosophers indicate that, well, actually, I should probably bring this up rather than trying to go by memory. But a non-trivial number of philosophers don't actually agree that current AI definitely doesn't have any sort of conscious state. So, I mean, I don't think current AIs are conscious in the way that we're talking about here. But let me just try to find this question actually, because this isn't just me nerding out on this survey, which I actually want to talk more about later. But Braxton actually appeals to authority later on, where he mentions a couple of philosophers as and quotes them as substantiating his point, which is a type of argumentation that Bill Craig uses a lot, and I really dislike. That is just sort of quote mining authorities, even when there's actually a lot of disagreement in the field. I mean, I suppose if you're trying to establish that like at least one person agrees with this, then that's fine. But that's that's often a fairly trivial point. The idea is normally that you want to see how plausible is this view or how many people view it. Why can't I find this? Ah, yes, other minds. It's under other minds. Okay, let me actually show you this because I think this is interesting. So part of the argument that Braxton is making here is that it's just sort of trivial that, which one is it? It's this one. Current AI is not conscious. So the question here is, so this is a survey of philosophy professors and I think some PhD students and so forth in major universities, mostly in the English-speaking world. So I think it's a very useful resource for understanding what Anglosphere/analytic philosophers tend to think about things. So you'll see here that the question is, for which groups are some members conscious? Critical, they don't have to all be, but at least some of them. And if you look down here, current AI systems, only about 3% think that they are, accept or lean towards, so, think to some degree that they are conscious. Now, that is slightly larger than the percentage who think that particles are conscious. Now, you might think, well, how can particles be conscious? Braxton mentions this actually a little bit later. This would be effectively a version of panpsychism, which is the idea that consciousness is sort of fundamental and to some extent everything is conscious. So this 3% being higher than 2% is not entirely surprising. So this says that, that there's some people who think that kind of everything's conscious, and maybe then there's a few extra people who think that not quite everything, but then AI makes the category there. So it's not a lot, but you can still find a few philosophers who would lean towards the idea that current AI systems are conscious. In terms of the proportion who think that adult humans, or at least some adult humans, are conscious, it's about 95%. So there's a small percentage there who are a bit unsure of that, although very few explicitly reject the idea. There are other views, like you can be unsure or have alternate positions there. Now, one thing that Braxton does not talk about at all, which I think is really odd actually in this video, is consciousness in other animals. So he talks about AI systems and he talks about humans, but he doesn't mention any other types of animals like mammals, fish, insects, worms, plants. And I think it would be really interesting to hear what he has to say about this actually, because I realize this is a little bit small. Apologize for that. Because some of his arguments, it's sort of unclear how they would apply to animals. So, obviously Braxton, I don't think this is going to be a big spoiler, thinks that consciousness comes from an immaterial soul of some sort. It's unclear whether he thinks that animals have such a soul. Now, he might, but then that raises questions as to, well, how many different types of souls are there, and how do souls fit into the evolutionary story with speciation events, and how do we understand where, like, at what level of life does souls stop? Because you see, if I say as a naturalist and materialist that consciousness is the product of complex nervous systems, then it makes perfect sense to say that consciousness is graded, that as your nervous system gets simpler or loses the relevant complexity, then consciousness kind of fades away. I don't know that it makes a lot of sense to say that souls kind of fade away. Like, it seems you either have one or you don't. Now, there could be different types of souls, but still you've either got one or you don't, right? I mean, and presumably rocks don't have souls, right? So what about flies? What about fish? What about amoeba? Like, what exactly has a soul? So what I'm saying here is it feels like if you're going to go down that route, you actually have to make a cutoff as to what has a soul and what doesn't. Whereas I don't think the naturalist has to say that. You don't have to say that there's a cutoff. You just say, well, it grades out at some point. Maybe, I mean, Nathan and I have talked about some other apologists who talk about this a bit, and there are different views I know here, but I think that it's a significant problem, actually. The reason I mention it now is because, unfortunately, Braxton does not mention this issue at all, which I think is quite disappointing because it'd be interesting to hear what he says about that. Anyway, so that gives us a bit of a framework. So yes, it's pretty unlikely, I think, that contemporary AI is conscious, but you will find the odd philosopher at least leaning towards that view, which is kind of interesting. Now, let's jump back to the video. I don't think current AI systems are conscious, by the way, but I just sort of wanted to mention that. So let's take stock of where we are. We've got a definition of consciousness, well, not a definition, but at least an idea of consciousness as something relating to a first-person subjective experience of what it is like to be something. Braxton says that, clearly as adult humans, we have this, and I agree with that. And he also thinks pretty clearly that current AI systems don't have that, and I also agree with that, although I've noted that there are a few philosophers who would be not so sure about that. And he then gives some examples to sort of flesh out the point. I find it kind of cringe appealing, not so much in this sermon particularly, I guess, but more generally in when sermons appeal to like pop culture stuff. Maybe this is just me, but it just, I don't know, always comes across as a bit forced. I also wanted to mention something about data as being a bit of a Trek fan. And I mean, obviously, it's just an example. It doesn't really matter, but I can't help myself commenting on this. I would say it's quite unclear from the show, Star Trek Next Generation, whether Data is conscious or not, in the sense of whether it feels like something to be him. I suspect that he actually is. In the show, it's ruled that he is a person, but that's not necessarily the same thing, or at least I don't know if we can assume that. I think it's pretty clear that he has free will, maybe not in the libertarian sense, but at least I would say in a compatibilist sense. He certainly makes choices and can act unpredictably and things like that. Data also in the show is shown to have a very keen moral sense, can form friendships, and all of these sorts of things. But what he can't do is experience emotions. I mean, until the very end, which he gets an emotion chip, or whatever. But most of it, he can't experience emotions. But he can form attachments to people, for example, and he actually talks about how this works. So I guess the point is that even in a fictional example like this, I think it's actually kind of complicated as to exactly what we can and cannot say about Data based on the evidence we have in that show, right? And we need to separate out different issues like feeling emotions, free will, forming friendships, having a first-person subjective experience, and maybe other aspects as well. And I think that, well, Braxton doesn't do that. He just sort of lumps them all together, and we'll see that a little bit later. So, the point is not really whether, Star Trek's just an example, whatever. But I think it's sort of interesting that even in an example that he's chosen to make his point, it's sort of that very example, I think, makes the point that I would make, which is it's actually more complicated than this. It's a bunch of different issues that we're lumping together. I think that we need to be more careful if we're trying to explain consciousness about what we're trying to explain. So that will come up again later. If people are talking about the survey. I'll do another video on that at some point. There are some interesting results there. Let's continue with this video here. I'll just jump forward to where we got up to.
Man who's inside of the suit, a real thinking, actually humans and other human beings. This seems like something that is really powerful and different than just a brain, because those robots have a brain of a sort. Another way to help you understand exactly the difference between your conscious first-person experience of the world, the way that you're awake to the world, like robots are not, is this thought experiment that comes to us from a man named Frank Jackson. Now, I want you to hang with me. This is the part where if you've got a thinking cap, put it on and straighten it up a little bit. This will cause you to have to think a little deeply about this. But imagine...
So I can't help making remarks like this, right? What is the implication of what Braxton just said? Like, just think about this, right? Again, I don't want to overinterpret it, but I can't help making this remark. So these people are at a sermon of some sort. They're at church, right? And he's just said, if you've got a thinking cap, put it on. Just what does that imply? First of all, not everyone there has a thinking cap. And second of all, most people don't already have it on. They don't bring their thinking caps to church, and nor even if they do, they don't put them on. I don't know. I just find that amusing that that sort of this sort of offhanded remark kind of implies that the people in the audience are kind of dummies or not thinking about things. Which, I don't know whether that's what you want to imply, but anyway, let's just keep going.
That we have a story of a woman who is 35 years old, and her whole life she's been in a black and white room. She's never seen color. Now, I know that this is hard for you to imagine, but just imagine that it's possible that we have a person who's 35 years old, and this woman has never seen color. Her favorite color, though she's never seen.
There are actually people, achromatopsia, who don't have cones at all, so they can only see in shades of gray. So that part of it's not actually a thought experiment. The thought experiment part is that then she goes out and then she can see color, which, to my knowledge, that's not possible because you can't restore cone vision if it's never been present. Anyway, I just find it amusing. He says, "I know you can't imagine that." Well, it's actually not even imaginary; like it's a real thing. Anyway,
seen color is red. She studied all of the symbolic imagery about the color red. She knows all about the wavelengths and the light and all that stuff that makes red possible, but she's never seen the color red. In fact, we could say she actually begins a program in college to try and get a degree in color spectrum theory, and she gets a PhD in color spectrum theory. Her emphasis is the color red, and she knows more facts about the color red than any other person on the planet. But remember, she's never seen it. Now, here's the question. Her brain has all the facts, but if she escapes the room and the first thing she sees is red, the question is, does she learn anything? She knows all the facts, that's in her brain. Does she learn anything when she experiences red for the first time? I want to say that I think she does. What she learns is what it's like to see red. She knew all the facts, but now she's got what it's like, this first person experience of the color red. That's what it means to be conscious, to have that kind of an experience. It's an amazing thing. And because of that experience of red being different from just the facts, it's like your brain serves up all the facts and all the data, and then you and your conscious experience make decisions based on those facts, and you decide what you're going to do, and you can imagine. In fact, some of the greatest things about being human are possible because of our consciousness, the things that matter the most. Think about free will, for example.
Yeah, I'll pause it there because then he brings in some of the other issues that I mentioned that I don't think should be conflated with first-person conscious experience. But yeah, so the thought experiment that he mentioned there is sometimes called Mary the Colorblind Neuroscientist. I don't think he actually said she's a neuroscientist, but that's the way I typically hear it described. Anyway, the idea is that she knows all of the facts surrounding, like all of the, physical and material facts surrounding physical and material facts surrounding color vision and how that all works and all of the processes involved in that at a arbitrary level of detail, like more than we know now. But she's never actually seen red herself. And the question is, does she learn something when she actually experiences that? My understanding of the purpose of the argument is to appeal to the intuition that she would learn something, like learn what it is like to see red. And this is supposed to, I think, indicate an argument that there's some sort of fact of the matter about what it is to experience red that exists beyond the material facts or beyond the physical facts. I'm not precisely sure. I think there are different versions of it. I will, actually intending to read a bit more about this sort of stuff soon. But the exact point of the argument, I think, is like exactly what it's intended to convey is not the main issue here. Braxton is using it as more of a thought experiment to illustrate how basically what he's going to be arguing, he's kind of already arguing it, is that conscious experience has to go beyond the physical world or the material world. Now, this argument is an interesting one. I don't want to get fully into it now. I think that it's plausible that Mary does learn something new, but I don't actually think that that's a threat to physicalism. Essentially, because it depends what you mean by she knows all of the facts. I might make an analogy that you could know all the facts about biomechanics and riding a bicycle, but still not know how to ride a bicycle if you've never ridden one yourself, because that form of knowledge is really non-declarative. It's non-propositional. And plausibly knowing what it is like to be a brain body system that actually processes color in a certain way, that's not a fact that you can sort of know propositionally. You just sort of have to be that system, or if you're not, you're not. Which raises an interesting question, by the way. Does God know what it is like to see the color red, or any other color? Because God doesn't have eyes, right? God doesn't interact with the physical light spectrum in anything like the way that humans do, or at all. I presume he doesn't, right? He's not embodied. So I'm not quite sure how God knows these facts, and that's actually, I think, a real problem, right? Because if God is supposed to know all, God is supposed to know all facts, right? So he can know everything that the neuroscientist knows, but well, then you get the issue of the incarnation. So I'm not quite sure, but you don't want to say that God learnt about color through the incarnation. That seems wrong, right? So let's put that aside for the moment and just say, absent the incarnation, how would God have access to first-person facts about what it is like to be a human experiencing color? Because by Braxton's argument, the only way that you can come to know those facts is to be that person in that experience. But God isn't and can't be that person in those experiences. So therefore, it seems by Braxton's own reasoning, God wouldn't actually know these facts. I've sort of mentioned this before, right? A stronger version of this is to argue, does God know what it is like to sin? And I'm not sure. Again, I'm not sometimes people get a weird idea when I say these things. They seem to imply that I've imagining that no Christian has ever thought about this or responded to it. Of course, I realize that there will be people who've responded to this. That's not really the point, right? The point is to advance the discussion. And so I guess with respect to what Braxton's saying here, it seems to me that this is not a good argument, right? Because if he wants to say that Mary learned something new, later on, Braxton is also going to say that consciousness comes from God. There seems to be a disconnect here, right? Because his argument for why Mary learned something new, it would seem to also say that God can't actually know these things. And so, like, we're conscious in a way that God isn't, or our consciousness transcends God's consciousness, or I'm not quite sure exactly, but it seems to be at odds with what he would want to say about God and the nature, the origins of consciousness. So for that reason alone, I don't think that this argument works, like on Braxton's worldview. But also, I don't think that it undermines naturalism or physicalism, because I think that we need to distinguish different forms of knowledge, essentially, and that if you just say knows this or knows that, I think that that's sort of too quick. Plausibly, there are some types of knowledge that you sort of can only hold if you are a system in a particular state. And think about it, consciousness in this way is supposed to be what it is like to be a certain thing. So I'm not quite sure how you could possibly even know that in principle without being that certain thing. Like, you could have a full understanding of all of the processes at work, but unless you actually run that simulation in your mind in full detail, you wouldn't really know that. So I suppose, yeah, it's not just knowing the facts, it's sort of running the simulation in your mind, so to speak. And only if you could do that in sufficient detail would you actually know what it's like to be that thing. But then you basically would just be that thing. Like, sort of like if you could fall asleep and dream about being a bat, but not an ordinary dream of being a bat, like in full resolution with everything realistic, then maybe you would know what it was like to be a bat. But at that point, you've basically just been a bat, right? So anyway, that's not a full answer, but maybe that's some initial thoughts. I'm not convinced that thought experiment. It's interesting, but I don't think it really undermines naturalism. If anything, I think it undermines at least certain forms of theism in the way that Braxton wants to argue for it, because it seems to imply that God can't have this knowledge either. Anyway, I think I made that point there. Now, Braxton's moving on now. It's going to talk about other things such as free will. So let's see where he takes this.
You have free will to make real choices that are meaningful because you have a conscious experience. Because free will is the conscious activity of looking at things and making a conscious decision of one thing over another thing. We have that. We have love, because love is a conscious decision to give of yourself for the good of someone else that you love. And we also have imagination, with the conscious activity of thinking about the way things are right now and how they could be later on. A song that hasn't been written yet, but you could write it, a work of art, someone who you are in love with, you can imagine what it would be like to be them so that you can love them better. The most important things about being a human being are things that we have because we are conscious. It's really important. And it doesn't seem like we had to be, because these robots aren't. In fact, I think we can...
Yeah, so I'm happy broadly to say that some of the most important things about being human do relate to or involve us being conscious. I don't really disagree with that. Consciousness is very important. The idea, though, that it has anything directly to do with free will, I'm not convinced about. These are separate philosophical issues, and I just don't quite see what the argument is there. Why do you have to have consciousness to have free will, or why does free will imply consciousness? I don't know what the argument is there. Maybe it's intuitive to some people, but it's just sort of not obvious to me. The way that people like Braxton, people who talk and think in a similar way about free will, the way they talk about the free will, I just find bizarre. They talk about it as if, well, I mean, what he said just here, your brain presents you with these facts and data, and then your free will just sort of picks between them and decides. Well, but how does it do that? Like, is it just literal magic, or is it just random? If there's a process that your will is moving through, then that's like data crunching, that's analysis. Even if it's maybe not algorithmic, well, maybe it is, I don't know, but whatever's happening, there's a process there. And if that's a process, then where does free will fit in? Like, I guess I just don't quite understand. I've made this argument in different forms of how free will doesn't actually seem to fit with the idea of rationality to me. Basically, because if you're evaluating evidence, there are objective criteria that you should use to evaluate that evidence, or arguments, or whatever, or data, as Braxton likes to talk about it. And then you apply those criteria, and then you get a certain output. Where does free will fit in there? Like, free will could, I suppose you could just decide to believe something else, maybe, but then that would be irrational. At least I would say, like, you should just believe what the best analysis of the evidence indicates. So I don't really understand why it's sort of a good thing to be able to sort of transcend that process of data crunching analysis and then just sort of pick something to believe or do as a response. That just seems irrational, or at least irrational, like outside of rationality. I don't know why that's desirable, or why that's sort of thought to be so great. I guess that's further beyond the topic here, but I just find it strange the way Braxton talks about it. And even all of that aside, I don't know how that connects to consciousness. Like, do you have to be conscious to do that? Like, I don't know. Like, couldn't you just exercise free will, but it not feel like anything to do that? I don't see why that's obviously absurd. Again, one is, does it feel like something to do this? The other one is, can you act in a way that where your action is not determined by any antecedent causes? Like, it's just not clear how those two things are the same, or imply one another. I just think they're separate issues. Similarly with love, why does the thing is, love has many different definitions as well. I suppose some definitions of love would define it as a subjective state, and then it would presumably, you'd have to be conscious to experience that. But I don't know that that's the only sense of love, right? You could describe it as a strong sort of preference towards well-being towards the other person, and caring a lot about it. And does that require a subjective state? I don't know that it's not obvious to me that it requires a subjective state. So I can see arguments about that. Also, the way that people like Braxton sometimes talk about love, I find weird. They talk about it as if you freely choose, in a libertarian sense, to love someone. I don't know that that's actually how love works. I suppose that people will have different experiences about that, if you can just sort of choose to love someone. Or that's even how we would want to think about love. Maybe it is. I'm not sure. But I've said this before. It seems to me that the way I think about love, that it should be at least a little bit more reasons responsive, that you love someone because of their lovely, or their loveliness making properties in some respect, not just for no reason at all. Anyway, I know different people have different views on this, but I just want to highlight that I think that Braxton's being just really fast and loose with throwing in free will and love there, and the way he thinks about them, I think, is kind of odd, and maybe not evaluated critically enough. But I actually don't think it's central to his argument here. So I guess he's just saying, look how important consciousness is, and yeah, okay, fine, we can agree with that, and we don't actually need to bring free will into it, I think.
Detail this a little more by thinking about what it would be like if we weren't conscious. If we had brains but weren't conscious. Now, we've looked at some things like that. We saw the robots. They have a computer brain, but yet no consciousness. And they don't have what matters most about being human. But we actually, in pop culture, like TV, movies, and stuff like that, have come up with an idea for a thought experiment of what it would be like if you had a human being with a body and a brain, but no consciousness. I wonder if any of you all, and it's a little awkward bringing this up in church, but I wonder how many of you have ever seen the television program Walking Dead? Anybody raise your hand out there? Okay, a few of you out there, and some of you are afraid to mention that in church or admit that. But Walking Dead is all about zombies. And what are zombies? Well, they're not real, Braxton. Yes, I know, calm down, they're not real. But even though they're not real, they give us a way of imagining what it would be like if you had a brain and a body, but no consciousness. And basically, you'd be wandering around following your instincts everywhere, basically. You clip out consciousness, and you clip out the most meaningful things about being a human: free will, love, imagination. And it doesn't seem like this is something that we've reproduced in artificial intelligences.
That's an interesting remark there. I didn't pick that up the first time. He says that, so again, I get that he's doing this just for presentation. He's talking about philosophical zombies, which is the idea it's physically identical to, say, a human being, but it doesn't have any subjective experiences. It doesn't feel like anything to be that person. That's a P zombie, or a philosophical zombie. He's relating that to the zombies of television fiction, and really they're not the same thing, right? A zombie in The Walking Dead or other show is not physically identical. Usually, there's some sort of either viral infection or some supernatural force that reanimates them. So they're not literally physically identical. But that's it's just a flourish, really. But the point is that he then says that if we did have this, if you had a brain and a body but no consciousness, you would just be following your instincts. Now that is bizarre to me, because just before Braxton said that your brain is doing all these calculations, right, and presenting data. And following instincts, I mean, I suppose you can talk about that as, instincts do involve processing of information, but it's often at a very simple level. The idea of an instinct is that there's often there's no sort of top-down control over it. And it's not very responsive to different circumstances or different factors that might modulate the response. It's fairly automatic and fairly consistent. And I don't know what that has to do with it feeling like something to be a person. Like, I mean, would you say that about modern AI, that they're just instinctual? I would say no, they're not. They're very sophisticated and can incorporate and process a lot of data. That doesn't make them conscious, right? But they're not just following instincts. I don't really know how that. maybe that's just a flourish to link it to The Walking Dead, because that's what zombies are like in zombie fiction. They just follow their instinct to, eat for some reason. But yeah, that I don't think that in any way connects to the notion of a p-zombie, which is that actually they would be identical in every respect. Like, you would talk to them and they would respond in exactly the way that a human would respond. That's the whole point of the thought experiment, that they're precisely identical in every observable respect. It's just that there's nothing there's nothing inside, right? There's no experience. There's no what it is like to be them. Yeah, so I don't know that that's actually deliberate, that he's trying to like appeal to people's intuitions, that if you took out consciousness, people would actually be like brain dead, like Walking Dead zombies who just followed instincts. I don't know that he's saying that, but I don't know. It did kind of come across that way.
You clip out consciousness and you clip out what matters the most. What I want you to do over the next few moments is I want you to think about all the things that are going on in the room. I want you to do an experiment with me. I want you to count all of the things that you are consciously perceiving over the next few moments. And if you've got a pair of 3D glasses, it might be a good time to put them on.
Okay, so this is super weird. Like, I thought that he was just going to pause for a few moments, or maybe they'd play a bit of music. But like, maybe this is just me, but I've never been to a church like this before. They have this whole like 3D presentation with all of this. Obviously, we can't see it properly on YouTube, right? But probably actually, I don't know if this music is like safe. But yeah, like, I don't know if they commissioned this or this is from somewhere else. But like, what is it? And then there's, they're playing music to it. I just find this very odd. Like, he's giving a sermon about these philosophical topics, and then they're just like playing all this, and it's Dorothy for some reason, and I don't even know what's happening. I'm muting the music because I'm a bit worried about YouTube's kind of finicky with music, so probably in trouble playing that. And then there's these like movie clips. Oh, sorry, Braxton's back. Sorry, hang on. What am I doing?
How many things you were consciously aware of during the midst of that? Probably not. You probably lost track. But it's amazing because all of that is possible because of your consciousness. We know consciousness is amazing.
Wait, there are bubbles
and
on
then
the
question
stage?
becomes, okay, well, what is it exactly? How is it possible?
Notice that.
So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 problems that I think there are when we discuss consciousness. And when we look at these 4 problems, I think in answering them, we can find out where the evidence leads and whether it leads to naturalistic atheism or something else, or maybe something to do with God and Christianity. So we're going to use these questions. How does matter wake up? Are you just your body? Are the brain and consciousness related? And does consciousness exist without the brain? So that's what we're
All right. So these are very good questions. Well, except 3. I find 3 is probably too vague, but I mean, they're fine. I'm just sort of thinking, I think it's actually fine. We'll just sort of let him walk through them. I think these are good questions. I think that Braxton actually has he doesn't really have answers to these questions. Well, okay. He has an answer to 4 and 2. So 2 and 4, his answer to 2 is no, unsurprisingly, and his answer to 4 is yes, unsurprisingly. So he has answers to those, but I don't think he has a good explanation for how those work. And 1 and 3, I think that his answers are actually quite confused. So let's see how we go here.
going to talk about here. And number 1, how does matter wake up? Well, you might think, well, what does that mean? I'm matter, and I woke up this morning. Well, you did wake up, and there are parts of your body. I mean, your body is made of matter. But what we mean is, how is it even possible for a brain to become conscious if your consciousness is just your brain? How is it that dirt wakes up? How is it that the lights are on in somebody's home? How is it that you can put it up?
So the dirt waking up, that's got to be a biblical reference, right? God makes Adam out of the dirt. I don't know why else he would use dirt as an example, because no one thinks that, well, I suppose like 2% of philosophers think, not many people think that dirt is actually conscious, right? The idea would be that a sufficiently developed, elaborate, evolved nervous system could wake up gradually over a period of evolutionary time and developmental time as well. Because a fetus is not well, an embryo at least is not conscious. I suppose maybe fetus is at some point in development, but it's at some point it's just a ball of cells. So that's definitely not conscious. So the point is that it doesn't just wake up one morning the way he presents it. So the way he presents the problem is, I think, kind of leading in one direction, but I guess that's
enough Legos together, so to speak, physical stuff, and then suddenly you have a person who's awake. It's a little bit of a problem. And by the way, just in case you think, well, yeah, you're going to say it's a problem for naturalism, just matter is all there is to explain how we're conscious. Of course, you're going to say that. You're a preacher, you're a theologian. Okay, I understand that concern, and that's a valid concern. So what I want to do is I want to introduce you to Philip Goff, who is a philosopher.
So this really pisses me off. as I said, I understand it's a sermon, so there's a lot of things that I'm going to say, yep, that's the format, whatever. But he doesn't have to do this, right? It's like the criticism he's responding to is, of course, I'm going to say this. This is my job to say it, basically, which I think is a good criticism. It doesn't refute the argument, but I think it's relevant, right? That he's kind of getting paid to say this specific thing. What is his response? Well, his response is just to find a philosopher who is saying something similar and then just sort of point to them and say, look, someone else says this. I just think this is quite juvenile, actually, because you can find a philosopher who say pretty much anything.
Despite great progress in our scientific understanding of the brain, we still don't really have even the beginnings of an explanation of how complicated electrochemical signaling is somehow able to give rise to an inner subjective world of colors and sounds and smells and tastes that each of us knows every second of waking life.
So this is a man, an expert, who's doing work on this very issue, and he says, we don't even have the beginnings of an explanation of how these complicated electrochemical signals give rise to this conscious experience that we have. And in fact, maybe some of you were thinking a moment ago, hold on, you threw up those images of all the consumer products and Alexa and Google Home and all those things.
Yeah, so basically the argument he seems to be making here is because this guy says it, therefore it is the case, which I just hate that in any field, but especially philosophy where things are so contested. I don't know that philosopher or the context of what he was saying there. I'm not that interested in it. It wouldn't really matter what he was saying. Presenting it in that way, I think, is really problematic. It's terrible philosophy, just to quote an authority. The only case would be if you're directly studying that authority, like if you're studying Hume, then it's fine to quote Hume as a point, as defense of your point. The other case would be just to simply show an example that someone has argued this. But to make a point like that, I think it's completely invalid and really irrelevant. Also, I want to comment on that maybe as someone who has a tiny bit of knowledge on this, doing a PhD in neuroscience, not specifically on consciousness, but I just disagree that we don't have even the beginnings of an explanation about how conscious states and arise, or whatever exactly the guy said. I think we have the beginnings of one, but I suppose it really depends on what you mean by the beginnings of something. That is vague, so there's reasonable disagreement there. Part of the issue is it's not clear what the question actually is, and I think that that's a big issue of the problem of consciousness. It's that what the question is supposed to be is so vague. So let me just talk a little bit about that. Obviously, I can't answer that question here, and I'm still thinking about it myself, but if you pose the question as, why does it feel like anything? Why is there any first-person experience associated with having a brain and a body and so forth? The question then there would be, well, as opposed to what? Like, as opposed to there being no what it is like to be that? Or why would it be that, right? I think there's sometimes an assumption that it should just be the case that we're all zombies. Like there's just no internal experience. And I guess the question is, well, why is that antecedently more plausible? Like why is that the default? It's just sort of unclear. I mean, I'm not saying there's nothing to explain. I'm just saying that I don't think that you can just assume that, well, obviously there would be no, that if it was just naturalism, right, that there'd be nothing that it would be like to be a person and have a brain. And the fact that there is means that, there's something really suspicious there. Like, I just don't see why it's obvious that there wouldn't be anything that it's like. So I think that in some sense you can just say, well, I mean, that's the way it turns out. Like it feels like something to be that. You could ask, yeah, but why does it feel like that? But is it more, would it satisfy you if it turned out that we were just p-zombies? And would we be asking, well, why are we p-zombies? Why doesn't it feel like something? I don't know that there's a real asymmetry here about which is sort of antecedently expected. I feel like people have an intuition that we kind of should be p-zombies, but that is that there should be no internal experience. I'm just not quite sure where that, how that can be justified. I don't know that there's a strong argument either way. Another way that you could frame the question is, well, not why does it feel like anything, but why does it feel like specifically how it feels? But then, of course, the question becomes, well, as opposed to what? Like, there's any number of things that it could feel like, I suppose. And it feels like whatever it does feel like, we would just ask, why does it feel like that? So I don't know that that's actually a well-formed question. It's sort of just like, well, this is the way it feels, and so that's what we're used to. That's not really an answer to the question. It's more just asking, what is the question trying to get at? I think that part of the question is trying to appeal to this intuition that we kind of should be, or it seems like that we ought to be p-zombies, but we're not. And so why not? And I guess I don't really share that. To me, it's just like, well, I don't really know. Like if you just asked antecedently, you have knowledge of all the physical facts, but somehow you don't know what it's like to be a person. You just ask, well, would it feel like something to be that or not? Like, I don't know which way you would go. I don't know that we have actually a good sort of prior on that, essentially. So that's another way to put it. It feels like this question is sort of assuming that the prior on it feeling like something is really low, whereas I just don't know that that's justified. Now, there's another side to this question, which is that suppose that physicalism is false and that there are immaterial souls. Why does it feel like something to be a soul? Like, is that just part of the, like, you could just say, look, that's just a brute fact that souls just are like that. But then I could say that about physical states. So it's just a brute fact that certain physical states feel like something to be that. So there's no explanatory value in positing a soul there, because you've just traded the naturalist has their brute fact and the dualist or whatever has their brute fact. This is sort of the Oppie approach, right? Where you just say, well, look, you just postulate either a necessity or a brute fact, so I can do that as well. The only difference is I don't have this extra substance floating around. So anyway, I'm not saying that resolves the debate, but I think that what I want to raise is two questions. So what is the question exactly? And are there any presuppositions underlying that question? And I feel like that sometimes the way the question is phrased, there's a presupposition that we should have a strong prior against subjective states under naturalism. And I just don't know what the justification for that is. And the second issue is, what are alternative explanations being proffered about why there are subjective states? And I mean, the one that Braxton has is some form of substance dualism, like, immaterial souls. And the question would be, well, why does it feel like something to be a soul? How does a soul wake up, would be to reframe his question about dirt. And if he would say something like, well, that's just the way souls are, they just do experience this, then well, why can't I just say, well, that's just the way brains are, they just do have experiences? The usual line of argument in philosophy, as far as I understand it, is to argue that there are incompatible properties, or that you just cannot, like as a matter of principle, produce subjective states from material substances. And I don't think those arguments work very well. But here it seems like Braxton is actually maybe the Mary argument was sort of intended to do that. But here it feels like he's more making an inference to best explanation. Actually, he does it pretty explicitly at the end, where he compares explanations, sort of. So he seems to be saying that his version of theism has a better explanation for why we have consciousness, subjective states. Whereas I think it has no explanation whatever, because it just says that we have souls, and why souls feel like something, well, they just do. Well, then I can just say that brains just do, and they're both pretty lousy explanations, but I feel like mine is simpler because I don't have to say an extra step and then just say it does. So anyway, so that's some thoughts on the whole issue of explaining and how does dirt wake up. Let's keep going.
And you said they're not conscious, and sure, they're not conscious. But maybe if we keep working on it, and people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and everybody else puts their fingers on it, maybe we'll get a complex enough brain that it will become conscious, even though it's not a human being. Well, I mean, that's something that is certainly a big topic today. But Roger Penrose, who is a famous philosopher and mathematician, and has been involved in some of the great scientific breakthroughs, and he says, I don't think this is one of the great mysteries. I don't think consciousness is in this glass of water, as he said, looking at a glass of water. He said, but it seems to be something we have, and I don't think it's just a matter of making things more complicated, and then somehow you'll be conscious. It seems to be something subtler than that. So that comes from an expert who says, it doesn't seem like complicated artificial intelligence is the answer. So there are two options that we're going to look at here real quickly. One option is maybe the way that dirt wakes up and you're awake to the world in a way that grass and robots are not. Maybe that's because everything is conscious. You're conscious, but everything is conscious. Believe it or not, this is a popular view that's getting more popular all the time in the philosophy of mind and in the science about this, and it's called Panpsychism. Now,
so actually, I think we actually have data on this now, at least in philosophy. I don't think this view is more popular in science. And based on the survey results, Panpsychism has maybe 2% of philosophers as adherents. So you're talking low single digits. I wouldn't say that's a popular view. I'd say that's an extremely fringe view. It has received some more attention recently. I don't know why he's emphasizing how popular it is. I have a suspicion about this. I don't want to say it because it's quite speculative about why Braxton's making a point of that. Maybe you can think for that for yourself. But I just think this is factually false, that it's quite a popular view. It's a fringe view, but it is discussed. It is true that it is discussed seriously.
Don't worry about that. There won't be a test, and you'll probably never need to know that. But you can Google it if you want to. Panpsychism is the view that everything on some level is conscious. Electrons are conscious. Cheesecake is conscious. Bricks are conscious. You're conscious.
I think it's more correct to say that Panpsychism is a view that consciousness is fundamental, rather than a derived property, like a reductive naturalist like me would say. I think it follows from that pretty much everything's going to be conscious to some extent. But No, that I guess that's a bit of a nitpick.
Conscious. Everything. This stage is conscious. Now, they don't think that it's conscious to the degree that you are, whatever that means, but to some degree of consciousness. The problem with that is there's really not.
Does Braxton not really know what it could mean to have degrees of consciousness? Like, I feel like we even experience that, you know, different forms of sleep, for example. People have different levels of consciousness there, or when you're waking up, you're sort of hazy and you don't quite recognize things or respond properly, or if you're drugged, things like this. I mean, you know, we have different levels of awareness, different levels of responsiveness, even in humans, right? Let alone talking about other animals or impaired states and so forth. I don't. Maybe this actually explains a bit that Braxton maybe thinks of consciousness as binary, like you have it or you don't. There's no spectrum, which raises, I think, massive issues, right? Because then he really does have to find an absolute cutoff of there is some species that is conscious and then a species that's very similar to that is not conscious. And I'd be interested to know where he picks that. Also, he has to make a argument there about the human development process as well. So if he believes, as I suspect he does, that life begins at fertilization, well, they say conception, right? But that doesn't mean anything. Like that, they want to say fertilization, right? The zygote. Like, is a zygote conscious? Because if a zygote has a soul and souls are the basis of consciousness, then a zygote is conscious, right? But that seems an absurd conclusion to me. And I mean, if we're going to say zygotes are conscious, then why not say that, like, plants or the stage is conscious? Now, Braxton hasn't said that. I'm inferring that from positions that I'm pretty sure he holds. But, you know, suppose he doesn't think a zygote is conscious. Well, if the soul is the basis for consciousness, at what point does the soul come in? There would have to be a point where it just becomes conscious, like it has a soul or it doesn't. So I don't know. The point I'm making here is Braxton is poo-pooing panpsychism, but I think his own view has these massive issues that sort of need to be addressed to make any sense of it. And I think panpsychism makes more sense. I'm not a panpsychist. I'm not a fan of the view, but I think it makes more sense, right? Because it seems to have more principled answers to what is conscious. It's actually just everything, but there's degrees, right? Depending on basically how things are arranged. Yeah, because I don't know how Braxton sort of tries to draw this, that tries to answer those sorts of questions. Anyway, let's keep going.
Any evidence. It's just kind of a way to kind of try to answer the question of how you became conscious. Well, because everything's conscious. Okay, so there's that, if you want to think about that for a moment. And then there's a naturalistic answer, like an atheist might say, an atheistic naturalistic answer that says, well, maybe the solution.
I hate it how they people like Braxton, I've heard it from many people, conflate naturalism and atheism, or at least imply that they're basically the same thing, because they don't really have anything to do with each other. Naturalism entails atheism, I think. Where you can't be a naturalist in any standard forms of theist, I would say. But being an atheist doesn't entail anything about whether you're a naturalist. Plenty of philosophers are atheists, but not naturalists. Phil Papisev actually makes that quite clear. Now, I am an atheist and a naturalist, but I don't like the implication that there aren't all other combinations of views there. And so, yeah, that really annoys me. They're quite distinct things. Why not just pick one of them? I mean, why even say both words? I don't know.
Is nothing is conscious, including you, at least not the way that you think. Alex Rosenberg, author of The Atheist's Guide to Reality, says the following: the illusion that there is something inside that has thoughts about stuff is certainly as old as the illusion that there are thoughts about stuff. They almost certainly evolve together as a package deal. But if the physical facts fix all the facts, then there can't be a me or you inside our bodies with a special point of view. When it fixed the facts, physics ruled out the existence of selves, souls, persons, or non-physical minds inhabiting our bodies. He later says about this, our brain navigates us through life very nicely, thank you, without ever thinking about anything. Now think about what's just been said. This is one naturalistic answer. There are others, but this is one naturalistic answer, is that, well, yeah, it is hard to explain how matter becomes conscious, but listen, the solution may be that everything's conscious, and it may be that nothing's conscious, including you, at least not the way that you think you're conscious. It's more of just an illusion, an afterthought. Your brain's really doing everything. Now, I'll just tell you as a pro tip, if any philosopher, atheist, Christian, or anybody else ever suggests to you that maybe you should adopt the position that you don't exist, then I would encourage you to reject that view, all right? So we've got those possible answers.
See, this is the sort of thing that really irritates me, because what Braxton just said there seems to indicate to me that he is self-conscious of what he's doing here. It's not like he doesn't realize it, because he threw in those remarks very briefly, which you could easily have missed, where he says, this is one naturalist view. There are others, but this is one. He just threw that as an aside and then sort of moved on for it. And he also threw in as an aside when he was saying that Alex Rosenberg doesn't think that selves or consciousness exist. He says, in the way that you think. And then he just moved on, because that's Craig loves to quote Alex Rosenberg as well, and I'm not hugely familiar with Rosenberg's views. But I understand that his basic point is that these concepts that we have of folk psychology, that they just don't actually pertain, right? That they're full of confusions, and therefore nothing has them. So it's analogous to a view in ethics, which is error theory, right? That the concepts that we have are just confused, and so they don't pertain. That there's nothing that in the world that corresponds to them. I'm pretty sure Alex Rosenberg doesn't actually think that persons don't exist. Like, I mean, persons in the sense of, he talks about selves, right? He's using that in the sense of the folk psychological belief, is my understanding. So I guess it is a bit of a tricky language game as to exactly what he would affirm. He'd have to come on himself to clarify that. But I guess the point is, yeah, he thinks, I'm not sure exactly. Well, someone like Rosenberg, I think, thinks that future developments in neuroscience will eliminate folk psychology and will have a proper vocabulary to describe these things. This is similar to, I think, what the Churchlands, like Paul and Patricia Churchland, not like those other Churchlands, Paul and Patricia Churchland say, that we should get rid of folk psychology, or at least massively reform it. And we're going to replace these terms like belief and desire and self and consciousness and so on with terms developed from neuroscience and cognitive psychology, which actually then refer to the real things that exist. Yeah, right. Nathan saying that was a joke. Rosenberg is the opposite, which is what I thought there. But yeah, so the point here is that Braxton, I think, knows this, but he can't help himself from making the jab, because on the one hand he says, look, Rosenberg knows these things exist, right? But he doesn't think that they exist in the way that you think, right? He thinks our concepts are confused about it, essentially. And Braxton gives a little aside indicating that he kind of does know that. But then immediately after that, he says, if someone tells you that you don't exist, then you shouldn't listen to them, as a philosopher. But that's not really what, that's a gross misrepresentation of what Alex Rosenberg is saying. He's not going around saying, hey, you don't exist, in the way that I think that Braxton is implying that Alex thinks it. I mean, again, it's hard because Alex thinks that we need to get rid of folk psychology language, so it's a bit hard to know what language to use, right? But the point is, I think he wants to make a cheap shot against Rosenberg's views, which I don't agree with, by the way. I just like it when people aren't strawman. He wants to make that cheap shot without also, but at the same time, he doesn't want to be vulnerable to this criticism. So he throws in these little asides. Like, I guess the question would be, if you wanted to be fair to Alex Rosenberg, why not actually just throw in a couple of sentences clarifying, yeah, look, what he means is he thinks these folk psychology terms like selves and belief and so forth are confused and don't have a clear meaning, and that we need to replace them with a more scientifically grounded language. That's something closer to what Alex Rosenberg actually thinks, right? Why not say that and then say, but that's silly for, I don't know, make whatever argument you like, instead of making this silly cheap shot that, oh, well, he thinks you don't exist, so don't listen to him. Ha ha, how dumb is that? Is the implication there. Anyway, so that really annoys me, because I don't think it comes across to me that Braxton is being deliberately unfair to Rosenberg's views and deliberately kind of strawmanning it for the sake of a cheap shot.
One doesn't have any evidence, and one seems like it doesn't make sense of our experience. But that's problem number one. We've got to come to an answer about that problem. But problem number two is, are you just your body? We had a song where he says, you have a body, you are a soul. You're not a body, you have a soul. Well, God wanted us to be spiritual, soulish beings in a physical body if you believe in God. But here's the question we've got to ask about this idea of, are you your body? If you're just your body and your brain is just what you are, and we do kind of think that way almost default, don't we? I mean, if you touch me, I say, you touched me. You touched my physical body. Maybe on my brain. Maybe that's what's going on. But do you know that your body actually isn't the same body you used to have? This may be shocking to you, but ever so often, your cells cycle out over 7 to 10 years.
Is he like making fun of his, or like, this may be shocking to you that your cells, die and are cycled over? Like, how could that be shocking to any person in a modern educated audience? Like, I'm not saying you need you expect people to have a lot of biology training necessarily, or particular knowledge, but people know that skin cells flake off, right? And that there's blood cells that have formed, and that the body's dynamic. I just don't know why Braxton says things like that. It almost seems like he's making fun of and the thinking cap remark from earlier as well. Anyway.
And are replaced by new cells. Some of them happen more quickly than others. Blood cells are different than skin cells, but even right now, you're fluffing off just look at your cells. You're fluffing off all these dead skin cells right here in our midst. And you're replacing those with new skin cells, which means after a couple of decades.
Yeah, like, I don't know. I don't want to get too far into speculating. I think he deliberately took the cheap shot because he wanted to do that. The reason I say that is because I think that because of the two asides that he made, which seemed like he was trying to cover himself and did have awareness of the criticism that someone like me would make, but then did the cheap shot anyway. It's almost like when someone says, I know you're not supposed to do this, and then does it anyway. Like, they can't then say, well, I didn't know. I don't know. That's just how I read it. But either way, I don't think it's good.
You don't have the same physical body that you used to have. And so we've got a real problem with what does it mean to talk about you? Now, this is an example that some of you may have heard before of this sort of idea, but whether or not George Washington ever chopped down a proverbial cherry tree, you familiar with that story? If someone put an axe in my hand and said, this is the axe, and there's only two parts, the head and the handle. This is the axe that George Washington used to chop down the cherry tree. Braxton, you're holding the axe. Now, the head of it's been changed 17 times, and the handle of it's been changed 30 times, but you're holding the axe. Well, am I? I mean, I don't really feel like I am because there's only two parts to this and they've all been changed, right? It's not the same axe. In the same way, if you're just your body and your body it gets changed and cells are replaced over time, at some point, you're not you anymore if you were your body. And I don't mean it like, oh, I'm not the same person I used to be. No, we're talking about you're literally not the same identity that you used to be. And that is a serious, serious problem. Whatever.
It's weird for me to talk about an identity as if it's an object. You're not the same identity. What does that mean? Identity is a relation between two things. Now, this question about the persistence of personal identity over time is, of course, a big one in philosophy, and not one I can address now. I hold to a Perdurantist view if people are interested. So I think that basically persons are four-dimensional entities. Actually, I think that all material objects are four-dimensional, but I guess that's a bigger question. So I don't find this question especially perplexing. I suppose if you think about it in the way that Braxton does, where it seems like you want to find a thing that is just identical across time. I think the Buddhists have it right here, that when you sort of look into yourself and you see thoughts, you see memories, you see perceptions, but all of those change, right? Even personality changes, at least to some extent, certainly since you're a child. And you actually don't find anything that's just sort of there consistently over time. And I mean, I think that's basically what a scientific view leads to as well. There are commonalities, right? And you can assign labels to commonalities like psychological continuities. But in terms of identities, the way that Braxton talks about, I don't think there is any such thing. And you see, this is then how you can come to a view like Alex Rosenberg, right? We say, well, there is no self, right? Now, I wouldn't say that. I would go down a different route. But if you understand self in this sort of this identity relation between whatever you are now, whatever you were when you were a child, like what is identical in those two cases? There seems to be no physical properties or even combinational properties that you can say are identical in those cases. So it just doesn't work, right? So if that's your notion of self, and there doesn't seem to be any facts of the matter about that, then you're going to have to get rid of the notion of self and say there are no selves, right? And I think that's something like, I don't know if Alex Rosenberg would endorse that specific argument, but that's something like how you get to his view that there are no selves, right? Now, again, I wouldn't go down that route. I would say, look, we just need to reform the notion of self. And actually, this idea of identity is silly anyway. It's really more of a continuity and of conscious experiences and relative similarities and things like that. So obviously there are answers to that question, but the point that I want to emphasize here is that what Braxton wants to say here is that your soul is what gives you continuity over time, obviously. And I sort of find this interesting because it sort of then leads to the question, well, like, what is a soul? Like, what makes up a soul specifically? Like, in virtue of what is my soul different to yours or Braxton's or whatever? Because I think you run into the same problem that, again, that Buddhist philosophy thinks about, like, because it can't be memories, right? Because memories change. It can't be personality traits because those can change. It can't be perceptions because those can change, like, completely over a lifespan. I could lose all my memories, right, and change personality, like Phineas Gage, that I think Braxton mentions later. They had an ironing rod go through his head and change his personality. So the point is, if I strip away all of those things that seem to define the difference between one person and another, well, like, what's left? What is it that actually distinguishes your soul from my soul? I feel like you just have to postulate that there's sort of something else beyond all of that that distinguishes one soul from another, but it's sort of not clear what it is. This question has been discussed in the psychological literature. It's sort of asking, like, well, what is a soul? Like, if it's just the bundle of thoughts and perceptions and whatever, then it seems that actually doesn't get you the identity that Braxton wants. It seems it's got to be something more than that. But then what is it? Like, is there some sort of ectoplasm thing that exists non-materially? I mean, maybe that's how Braxton thinks about it. I don't know. But like the point I'm making here is the soul, it seems, can't be just a bundle of your conscious experiences and memories and stuff, because all of those things change. There has to be some identity there that, well, according to Braxton, that preserves the identity. But what is it? It's almost like he imagines a soul to be some sort of well, I don't know, some sort of glowing cloud with a label on it that says, this is Braxton's soul, this is James's. And the label stays the same, even if everything else stays the same. But obviously, like, that's not really what it is, right? So like, what is it? What is it about the soul that distinguishes it? This is actually an interesting point, if I can geek out a bit in terms of fundamental physics, because when you go down deep enough, there's nothing to distinguish between different fundamental particles. Like all electrons, for example, are identical to each other. And you actually have to you have to do the particle statistics differently when particles are indistinguishable, because otherwise you'll do the calculations wrong. So this is actually quite a fundamental point, not even just philosophically, but physically as well. If there are no properties to distinguish between two things, then they're identical. And it seems that what Braxton needs is something to distinguish between different souls that is consistent and identical over time for different souls, right? Like the labels on different souls. But I just don't know what that would be. It seems there has to be some substance to the souls that's distinct from each other and that persists identically over time. But I just, like, well, what is that? It's a bit of a mystery. I'm not saying there's no answer, but again, I think that there are problems for his view that he's not really letting on here. Let's continue.
For the solution is it's got to handle problem number 2. Number 3, the next problem is, are the brain and consciousness related? See, the issue here—
Oh, sorry, I just remembered something else I wanted to mention. This notion of a persistence over time is not just a problem for persons, it's a problem for other things as well. So let's say the United States of America, right? That's a country. Presumably you want to say that it's the same country that existed at least when George Washington was president. So, 220 years ago or something. Now, obviously the country's changed a lot since then. I mean, the states are different. All of the people are different. The area is different. The government forms have changed a lot. I mean, I guess it still has the same constitution, maybe, but the constitution isn't the same as the country, right? It has been amended. And the United States could adopt a different constitution. Other countries have, like France, for example. So I guess the point is, we understand that countries are things that exist over time, right? Unless you think that, I guess you could go down the full route that actually countries aren't real. They're just all a social fiction. But I don't know. That's a pretty strong view to me. And I doubt that Braxton would want to say that. So then the question is, in virtue of what is a country the same country over time? Because there doesn't seem to be, like, countries don't have souls, right? So the point is, you get the same questions. I mean, this is the ship of Theseus is the classic example of this, right? And this is just a ship. Like, in virtue of what is the ship the same ship over time if you replace all the parts? Ships don't have souls, presumably. So the question is actually a problem philosophically for any material object, or even like social systems. I guess those supervene on material objects, presumably. Braxton has an answer that applies only to human beings, maybe to other animals, but he hasn't been clear about that. But then how does he answer the questions in other cases? Like, you have to have an answer there. Now, the answer that I would make is a sort of a bundle of properties continuity type argument, and which I think applies to everything, and doesn't give you identity over time. But I don't think there is such a thing. Whereas Braxton has an answer for one very special case, but doesn't seem to know what to say about the other cases. And I feel like whatever he would say about the other cases, I would say, well, why not just say that about humans as well? Why would there be two different answers? That seems a little ad hoc. I mean, I guess there could be, right? But so the point here is that this problem of identity over time of material objects, of composite material objects, is a widespread problem. It applies to anything like this: ship of Theseus, countries, people. And Braxton seems to think that they'll only deal with this problem when it applies to people, because then he can roll out his answer of souls. But then just doesn't address it in other cases, which then raises the question, how does he address it in those other cases? And whatever answer he gives, why not apply that to people as well? Unless he wants to say that all of these things have souls, which would be an interesting answer, I think.
here is, it does seem to be the case, doesn't it? That we can change our conscious experience by interacting with our brains. Some of you may be on anxiety medication or depression medication. This is something that changes your brain chemistry. And then because of that, your conscious experience changes. I mean, that's the whole point, right? And then, of course, there are great stories, like amazing stories anyway. Like there's a man who had a railroad spike shot through his head and he survived. And he actually went on living, but he had a different conscious experience.
Yeah, that's Phineas Gage.
So it does seem like there's some connection between our consciousness and our brain, but yet they're not the exact same thing. And so we've got to come to a solution about that. And then 4, we've got to have a solution about whether consciousness exists without the brain, without the physical body, without the brain. Now, this one is a bit mind-blowing, and you're about to, some of you might roll your eyes a little bit, but just stay with me. It's too early for you to thinking I'm a kook yet. But I want you to.
Oh, I find this quite funny as well. Braxton actually seems like, again, this is my inference, but he actually seems embarrassed about talking about near-death experiences, which is what he's about to talk about. Because he mentions this a number of times, like, oh, you're going to think I'm a kook, or this might sound weird, or we don't believe in this sort of thing, which I just think is very interesting. I don't know exactly. First of all, if you believe in a lot of the things that Braxton believes in, I'm not sure why you wouldn't be all right with near-death experiences, just based on consistent epistemic standards. I would sort of say that the type of anecdotes that you appeal to, if this anecdote is good enough, well, then why not an anecdote about a near-death experience? Of course, the problem is that then you end up believing in homeopathy and everything else. But that's another issue. I just think it's kind of interesting how many times he seems kind of a bit sheepish about talking about this. This is just the first time you'll see he mentions it again.
Understand that we have these experiences that happen that are written up in the medical journals. People talk about them all the time. 30 million cases in America, England, and Europe that are near-death experiences. Now, there's a lot of eye rolling when you talk about near-death experiences, because even among Christians, it sounds a little wacky. It sounds a little psychic.
Third time he's mentioned
we don't like that sort of thing. But for Christians,
we don't like that. So
Christians should be totally okay with the notion that we survive physical death, right? That's kind of one of the things we talk about.
Yeah, okay, so this is a theological point here, which, again, I confess ignorance on. I don't actually understand this point. Christians should be okay with the idea that we survive physical death. So why is that central to Christian teaching? I don't actually understand that. It seems to me what's central to Christian teaching is a resurrection, a restoration of the physical body, maybe in a perfected form, right? But the resurrected body is what survives. This is what happened with Jesus, right? Jesus didn't walk around as a soul. He came back as a body, which actually more supports, I think, a physicalist. I know there are Christian physicalists out there, so there are people who hold this view. This seems to support the idea that actually the body is critical. Jesus didn't come back until he had his body back. Likewise, again, my understanding is that the righteous who go to heaven will first be resurrected. So I know that many Christians do believe in a soul, but I guess the question is, why is it sort of automatic that a Christian sort of straightforward, that this notion of you surviving your death of your physical body follows from Christianity? Like, again, it seems like just a simplistic, straightforward reading of, say, the Gospels would indicate that you need a physical body to come back. I don't know. I find this kind of weird, like that resurrection is so critical, but then somehow they seem to forget about it or put it to the side when talking about the idea that people survive the death of their physical body.
But these stories are amazing. And often they're evidential and seem to indicate that consciousness continues even without the brain functioning. When people have no measurable brainwave activity and no heart rates. And yet they are resuscitated later, and they talk about amazing experiences and facts that can be checked, or they talk about another very interestingly and mysteriously heavenly world that they experience. Now, one of these stories comes from Kimberly Clark, who talks about a patient named Maria.
So just people might be, I'm not going to talk about this in detail. I've done several videos with Nathan looking at near-death experiences and some of these evidential claims. The TLDR is that every time one looks into these, the evidence is far weaker than is presented. Unfortunately, you can multiply anecdotes indefinitely. So, you could spend an entire lifetime looking into every case that people give, and I'm not going to do that. But yeah, it's all about substantiating what was known at what time and when reports occurred, and did that actually occur when there was no brain activity and what was documented and things like that. And it's actually very hard to substantiate. And we don't have any near-death experience. We don't have any evidential near-death experience cases where it's documented under controlled conditions that the patient was able to provide information that they provably could not have accessed beforehand. And by that, I mean that the idea of, putting numbers on top of machines that was then checked beforehand, and then they asked people, that study's been done, right? You ask people, did you see the number? At least one study like that has been done, and there were no examples of that being reported by people who experienced near-death experiences. If we did get that evidence under controlled conditions, then that would be compelling. Obviously, it would need to be replicated and other things. But the point is that that's never happened. There are no cases like that. It's all under uncontrolled conditions with anecdotes and other things that are just not reliable. So that's the TLDR. If you're interested, you can check out some videos that Nathan and I have done. I'm not going to talk more about the specific cases, But there is some interesting theological points that I think we can draw out of what Braxton's about to talk
And when
about
Maria
here.
had no brainwave activity, measurable brainwave activity, and heart rate, she had an experience like this. When she was resuscitated later, she talked about how she had left her body during the interaction, during the surgery or whatever, and she actually could talk about what was on the floor in the room and what the doctors were doing and things getting moved around while they were trying to save her life. She actually said she went outside of the hospital, and that on the roof of the hospital, there's a blue tennis shoe with a worn-out spot right where the pinky
Yeah, we
toe
actually
should be.
looked at this
They went and
specific
checked it out.
case.
Guess what? She was right. There was a blue tennis shoe up there, same style, she said, with a worn-out spot exactly where she said it would be. These stories are amazing because they suggest, there are evidence that suggests that your consciousness actually continues when your brain isn't functioning. This is amazing. One of my favorite stories is a story of Gary Habermas tells. He's a philosopher at Liberty University, and he tells.
So if your consciousness can survive without your brain, then what is your brain doing the rest of the time? What are neuroscientists doing when they poke around the brain and measure its activity and correlate that with different experiences? It literally makes no sense if that's all unnecessary. All the biology has to be thrown out. If consciousness can exist, if human consciousness can exist without a brain, literally nothing in neuroscience or most of like the rest of biology makes the slightest bit of sense. Because like, well, evolutionarily, why would we develop this brain if you don't actually need it to perceive and do all these other things? How does that information get back to your muscles so that they can move? If your immaterial soul can sort of perceive it separately from your body, like. There's a million questions you could ask here, and Braxton won't have answers to any of them because it doesn't make a lick of sense. Now, this doesn't apply to every version of substance dualism, because more sane versions of substance dualism won't actually say that you can have consciousness without the brain. It says that you need both. And that's what Braxton says sometimes. But then other times he says, actually, you can have consciousness without the brain. And at that point, it's not really interaction of substance dualism. I don't even know what it is. Like, that's not dualism. That's just a soul without a brain. Like, dualism has to have the both, right? So I think dualism is wacky, but this version where you can, like, most of the time it needs the brain, but then sometimes it doesn't for no reason, but then it can go back. Like, it's literally magical thinking. This view, I think, I don't know of serious philosophers who defend this form. There are a small minority who still defend substance dualism. I think they're mostly Christians, not exclusively. But like this notion where like souls can go out and then experience things and come back, which Braxton seems to think, that's just totally nuts. I just think that's completely indefensible.
Tells a story about how he was giving a talk like this before a group of nothing but medical professionals. And as he was talking about the heavenly experiences that people have when they encounter these near-death experiences, he said a woman who was the wife of an ear, nose, and throat doctor over on this side of the crowd stood up. She said, "You're talking about heaven, and I can tell you all about it. I've experienced that." And after a few moments of them staring at her like an animal cracker, like you all are staring at me right now, an oncologist who was an atheist stood up on the other side of the crowd and said, "Well, don't just stand there. Tell us about it." And she said, "Okay, I was giving birth to our third child, and I bled out on the table, and I was declared dead." Now, we're not saying she was really dead. Modern medicine can come pretty close to crossing that line and bring someone back. But while she had no brainwave activity, no heart rate, she said, "I was in an amazing place, a heavenly place." And she said, "I can tell you about it. I'll tell you about the color." And then she stopped herself and said, "No, because when I say color, you're thinking of red and green and blue. These are colors that the human eye can't perceive." She stopped and said, "I can tell you about the music." And then she said, "No, because when I say music, you're thinking about Mozart and Beethoven. This is music like you've never heard." She said, "I guess I can't tell you about it." He said, "Let me ask you this. Are you convinced you were there?" She said, "I'm more convinced I was there than I am that I'm here right now." And he said, "My understanding is that the strongest bond two human beings have is the bond between a mother and her child. Do you agree with that?" And she said, "Yes." He said, "Let me ask you this. You had two sons who you knew and loved, and one who was you carried for 9 months but had not yet held in your arms. If you had your way, would you have stayed there, or would you have come back to be with your family?" She looked at the ground and she began to weep. And she said, "He could have raised our family. I would have never left that incredible place." You say, "Braxton, do you think that woman went to heaven?" Man, I don't know. But I'll tell you what, there are millions of stories of near-death experiences that seem to suggest we survive after our brains aren't functioning. And what you should think about.
Okay, so if that woman didn't go to heaven, where did she go? Did she go anywhere? This really annoys me. Again, because Braxton wants to eat his cake and have it too. He wants people to think that this story is in some sense veridical, that the woman went somewhere and experienced something real that was more than just sort of psychological. I mean, if something psychological, it's real, right? But I think you know what I mean, that there's something beyond the psychological aspect to it. He definitely wants people to think that, but he doesn't want to commit himself to saying that this woman sort of went to heaven. Because, well, first of all, theologically, I think that's highly problematic. Where do we get this idea that people can go to heaven and then come back from it and go back to their body? What, like, does that even make sense of Chris? I just don't, like, what? No, I don't think it works that way. And also, does the way she described heaven, does that fit with the notion of heaven as, I don't know, maybe it does. That seems a bit of an odd way that heaven would be to me. And if sort of anyone can just sort of go there when they die but don't actually die, I mean, why wouldn't God just sort of make Earth like that. I don't know. It feels like he's holding out on us if there's something that great. But whatever. I guess the point I'm making here is I don't know what point Braxton is making. Are we supposed to take that story as indicating that this woman went to heaven? If so, we have a lot of questions. If not, then why tell us the story? I mean, what exactly? It feels like we're just supposed to go, ooh, that's cool, without really thinking about it too much. Because if you think about it, I don't really think it makes any sense under his worldview or under my worldview. I mean, under my worldview, I'm going to say, I don't know, she had some sort of psychological, neurological experience. Actually, these things are quite common, and we don't have a full explanation, but I don't think we need to postulate that there's some realm beyond our own, right? Now, Braxton, I don't know how he would explain it. Like the woman sort of went to heaven, but God's like, not quite yet. Like, doesn't this happen in The Simpsons where like you get knocked out and then you go to heaven and then God's like, it's not your time, and then you go back? I mean, does he really think that's how it works? Like, because that's just laughable. I don't think that's defensible. So what is this good for? Like, what's the point of this story? I reckon if he was here, he'd probably just say he's just trying to get people to think about it. I reckon that's what he would say. In which case, I would say, why can't you tell the story that you would actually be willing to, defend and you think is actually legitimate, instead of this one that you're not actually willing to stake anything on, if you want people to think about it.
About that for a moment. I want you to listen to this song, beautiful song about life.
And then there's a song, another one.
Death and it's powerful song. Powerful song. We have to face the reality of death and what it means for our lives and how we live our lives and whether there's hope. As we come to the end section here, I want us to draw together some of the threads of what we've been discussing, and I want us to think about what it means. So let's look at some of the options that we've mentioned earlier for what consciousness is and how it's possible, and let's look at how those options answer these 4 questions, because they need to answer these 4 questions. So
so this is why I say that he seems to be making an abductive inference to the best explanation here, because he's talking about answering these questions and comparing the views, which I think is a good approach. But it means that then his preferred explanation actually, has to do some explaining. It's not a deductive argument against physicalism. It's a inference to different explanations. And then we have to ask, well, how does his proposed explanation fare? I think we get about 1 sentence for what his proposed explanation is supposed to be, which is typical from these sort of approaches. Like Craig comes to mind here, who spend almost no time talking about how their prophet explanation, like God did it. I mean, it's always God did it, right? How that actually explains anything, provides any explanatory insight. We just get a lot of talk about how naturalism fails to. Anyway, so we'll see where Braxton goes with this here.
First, how does matter wake up? Are you just your body? Are the brain and consciousness related? Does consciousness exist without the brain? So let's talk about those for just a moment. We have one option, which is the option that's panpsychism, which is a weird, thing, but the idea that everything is conscious. Every slice of pizza, every earlobe, every chair in this room, everything is conscious, right? Okay, how does that stack up to answering these questions? Well, how does matter wake up? It would explain that pretty well, because it says it didn't wake up. It's just that it's always been there. It's baked into the system. Consciousness is a part of everything. Are you just your physical body? Well, this answer could also say about that, well, yeah, maybe you're just your physical body because, the consciousness is built into that stuff. But the problem is, it still wouldn't explain how you continue as the same person over time, because those bits, even if you want to say they're conscious, get traded out and you have a new body, and on that view, you'd have a new consciousness. Well, what about the fact that the brain and consciousness are related? That if we affect the brain with medication or an injury, then it does affect consciousness. Well, this view would answer that all right, but it wouldn't answer near-death experiences and how it is that the evidence suggests we go on consciously living after our brain no longer functions. So it doesn't answer that well. All right, so let's put that one aside for a minute. What about atheistic naturalism? Naturalism that says matter is all there is, it doesn't answer how does matter wake up. There's no answer to that, because if you just say no one's conscious, nothing is conscious, well, then matter didn't wake up. And even if you don't say that, if you're an atheist, but you want to say we are conscious somehow, there's no explanation for how it is that dirt put into the right order in a brain makes you awake to the world. So there's a big...
Again, so this is where it seems that the cheap shots. So can you find me, Braxton, a naturalist who says that dirt put in the right order becomes aware or something to that effect? I don't know. I suppose there's probably someone who said something like that, because there are people who like to put things in a particularly, controversial way, like Dawkins' quote that about the purposelessness that Craig likes to quote all of the time, even though I think he was missing the point of it. But I kind of doubt that there are many people defending that, because that's a silly view, right? The idea is that sufficiently complex neural systems, or at least systems such as neural systems, for systems such as those, there is something that is like to be that thing. again, the question is, well, I mean, we might not be able to explain quite why that happens, but why is it? Why would we expect that it wouldn't be that way? I just don't know that there's much of a strong pry either way here. So I don't know that it counts as much evidence for anything. Is sort of my meta point there. Why I think it would be that it would feel like anything. Why I think it wouldn't feel like anything. Why would it go either way? And then in terms of why does it feel like that specific thing? Well, whatever it felt like, if it felt like something, you would ask why it feel like that. So I don't actually think that there's a whole lot of explain to do there. That's just what it is. And whatever it was you'd ask that question. It's sort of like asking why is Earth the size it is? Well, whatever size it was, you would ask why it's that size, right? Because it's not a perfect analogy, but I think you get the point there. So I'm just not really very persuaded by that issue of how does dirt wake up, as he frames it.
Problem there. It would explain why when you damage or affect the brain, it does affect consciousness because you're just your body. But again, it also wouldn't explain how it is that we seem to go on having some kind of a conscious experience when the brain isn't functioning at a measurable level. So what do we have here?
Yes, well,
what we have is neither one of these options works. But as you might have guessed, there's a third option, at least. There's a lot to be said that we can't cover here, but there's at least a third option. And the third option is this. Maybe consciousness
so here's his explanation.
is best explained as coming from consciousness. Maybe a conscious creator made the world with the intention that there would be conscious beings in it who would then be able to interact in this amazing world of sound and color and experience. Maybe this conscious mind would like for conscious minds to be able to commune with him in a conscious way. Maybe God is the best explanation for consciousness. How does that explain these questions? Well, it would explain how it is that, or why it would resolve the problem of why it is that matter can wake up, because matter doesn't wake up. Matter makes up your physical body and the hardware of your brain, but it doesn't explain your conscious experience. On this view, your consciousness is your soul, and your soul, it lays on top of you, and that is the part of you that goes on, and that is how you're conscious. Well, what about the idea of, are you just your body? How is it?
Okay, so I mentioned this before. So Braxton's answer here is that your matter doesn't wake up. Matter is dead, like it doesn't feel like anything, but souls feel like something. It feels like something to be a soul. A couple of points here. First of all, what does that have to do with God? Like, why do souls depend on God? I guess Braxton's going to say, well, that's where they came from, right? But you could say that about anything. You could say that that's where matter comes from. God made it. So I don't know why you have to postulate God here. If you really want souls, you can just say, well, there are souls. Why does there have to be God? I don't see in any way the connection between God and soul. So that would be one issue I'd like clarification. If Braxton convinced me to believe in souls, then I believe in souls, but I wouldn't believe in God. Like, where does God fit into the picture? I don't God created souls, but I mean, how do you know that? Like, God could create anything, or maybe God didn't create it. It's the same question with anything else. Did God create it or not? I don't know why souls are more likely for God to make them than something else. So that's one issue. It doesn't really seem to connect to God. Now, the second issue is Braxton's asking, well, how is it that a lump of dirt wakes up? And he says, well, it doesn't. The soul wakes up, or always was awake. Well, then the question is, well, how do souls wake up? Like, well, why does it feel like something to be a soul? And I think that Braxton would just say, well, that's just the way it is. It's sort of intrinsic to it. That's part of its nature. Well, then I would say, well, that's intrinsic to a brain organized in a certain way, or sufficiently complex nervous system. It just feels like something to be that thing. Is either of those a worse explanation than the other? I don't think so, except for the fact that we all agree that brains exist, whereas we don't all agree that souls exist. Like that. So there's a discrepancy here. I think that my explanation is simpler. It's not a very good explanation. It's not very satisfying, right? It doesn't really explain exactly what is it about brains that makes it feel like something. But then neither does Braxton's. He just says that it is that way. He doesn't say how it does that. Notice that there's often a slippage here, a slippage from how to why. When he's talking about naturalism, he talks about how does a brain give rise to consciousness, or how does the brain feel like something? When he switches to souls, he starts talking about God wanted it that way. That's a why question. That's not a how question. How, Braxton, do souls feel like something? How does it produce this experience? And he doesn't have an answer to that. No one has an answer to that. And this is where I disagree with the philosopher before. He said we don't even have the beginnings of an answer to how a brain is. No, we have the beginnings of an answer, right? I've got quite a lot of textbooks there that at least I think give us some of the beginnings. I realize you can't actually see that bookshelf. With all my neuro books on it. There's a good one here, Principles of Neuroscience. It actually doesn't say that much about, like, it has quite a bit about like visual perception, which is part of consciousness, right? I'd like to see a comparable book for how souls give rise to consciousness. I mean, there isn't such a book, right? Because the research program of dualism is just not non-existent, because it makes no predictions. It can't answer any how questions. There's no mechanisms to investigate there. There's no empirical studies that can be done, rigorously at least. It's just a complete dead end. That's why it's a terrible explanation. Whereas physicalism at least has a starting point. We're not very far down that road yet, but I think that we have the beginnings at least, whereas dualism has zero. And indeed conflicts, I think, with modern science in a whole bunch of ways, like conservation of energy, for example. But anyway, the meta point here is Braxton doesn't have an explanation for how souls are conscious. They just are, according to him. So if that's good enough for him, why can't I just say, well, brains just are? And he tries to hide this, I think, by talking about why souls exist or / are conscious, because God wanted them that way. Well, okay, that raises a question. If God wanted brains to be conscious, could he make them conscious? I think Leibniz raised this question. Could God make rocks that were conscious if he wanted to? It seems that he could, right? I mean, why not, right? He's supposed to be omnipotent. There's no logical contradiction there about a conscious rock. So I guess you have to say that's metaphysically impossible. But then the question is, why is it metaphysically impossible? The p-zombie argument is supposed to establish that it's metaphysically possible that there could be, physically identical brains and bodies to us that were not conscious, but it doesn't attempt to establish that it's actually impossible that such things could be conscious, just that it's possible that they couldn't be, right? It's, it's a different direction there. So I guess the point is Braxton then, it seems, is forced into the view that, look, the reason God made us as souls that are conscious and not just bodies is it's actually impossible for God to make bodies that are conscious. Or I suppose you could say God just really, really likes souls for some reason. Although he also really likes bodies because he gave us bodies as well, even though souls can be conscious all by themselves, as is clear because Braxton points to these near-death experiences. But God wants to add bodies to it because of unspecified. You see how ridiculous all this is? Did I say it was Leibniz? I was thinking Locke, but I might have said Leibniz. Excuse me. Yeah, Locke was the one who was asking the question about if God wanted to make rocks conscious. Thanks, Nathan. I think I muddled that one up. They both start with L, so that's my excuse. Anyway, so I guess the point is, this is why I think Braxton's explanation is terrible, because he doesn't. He wants the naturalist to answer the how question, but he doesn't have to answer the how question, because there is no answer to the how question. It just does. Which, well, I can say that as well. But then, in answer to the why question, it just pushes us back to, well, what these questions about, well, why would God want to make us with souls if he could make us with bodies? And he clearly does want us to have bodies, but he also wants us to have souls. But the souls apparently can do the job perfectly well by themselves. It's just a big muddle. Why would anyone believe this? I just don't understand. I'm not saying why does anyone believe Christianity or anything. I'm saying why this particular combination of views. It just seems to be an absolute mess when you actually sort of think about it and work through the issues. So yeah, I find it extremely unpersuasive. At the very least.
You remain the same person right now at age 40 that you were when you busted your knee when you fell off your bike at age 10. Well, the body might be changing and your body might become a different body in a certain sense as cells cycle out, but the soul would continue unchanged. Not say that you don't learn things, not say you don't have experiences, but the nature of your soul stays the same, and so your identity is.
Yeah, well, what is the nature of the soul if you strip from it personality, experiences, perceptions, and all of that stuff? What is it? What is the nature of the soul? It's like he talks about it as if it has some intrinsic nature that's distinct from any of those things. But I'm just not sure what that would be. Like, what is it? What is it to be one? How is one person distinct from another apart from all of those things? Like, if I asked you, what is it that makes, I don't know, Braxton, or me? And you would give all of these specifics, right? But all of those things could potentially be changed. I suppose you could say, well, I was born in a particular place. And that won't change, right? But I could forget that. And then it seems that, my personality could change if I had brain injury or whatever. And so I don't know that, I guess it depends on your theory of reference, right? But the point I'm making is that if you think that what it is to be a person is sort of intrinsic to what they are at a particular time, then all of those things are changeable. And so it's just a bit odd to me that then Braxton thinks that there's some part to your soul or aspect to it or whatever that is consistent over time, that's not any of those things. I don't know what it is. It seems a bit mystical, mysterious to me. It seems to honestly just be added in solely to solve this problem. And remember, it's not a very good solution because Braxton faces the same problem with respect to continuity of other composite objects over time, like nations, countries, or ship, or anything really. Whereas I think I have a principled answer that applies across those cases, whereas I think Braxton has to still give a different answer for those other cases. And finally, Braxton's answer about the soul raises issues about whether animals have souls. It raises an issue when a body becomes ensouled, and then does that entail that a blastocyst with 32 cells is conscious if the soul exists into it at that time, or if not, well, when does the soul come in? Like, what does that even mean? How does a soul attach to a body? Like, what could that even mean if souls are not physical? How can they then be associated only with one? Like, so many questions that don't seem to have sensible answers and seem to just be entirely ad hoc. And honestly, I would say medieval superstitious type thinking, like the idea that a soul associates itself with the body at some point and become detached and come back. Like, this is something from a ghost movie. I can't believe we're talking about this in the 21st century. I mean, Braxton's not explicitly saying these things, but I don't see how you can fail to talk about what Braxton say and not then ask, or someone not ask these questions about, well, hang on, how does all this supposed to work? Braxton's trying to present it that his theory or explanation provides answers, whereas I think the answers that it provides are illusory, and it raises a bunch more questions that you just don't have under naturalism.
Still intact. What about the idea that of these near-death experiences that you can live consciously after your brain isn't measurably functioning? Well, obviously this has a great answer to that, and it also even explains why many people have a very interesting afterlife sort of experience that they talk about later. This answers that perfectly well. Your body dies, but your soul continues, your consciousness continues. Now, there is one problem.
It doesn't follow that because souls exist, they would continue after the death of the body. That could extinguish the soul, right? Obviously, because most Christians, as I understand it, don't believe in pre-existence of the soul. As a Mormon, I believe that, and personally, I think it makes a heck of a lot more sense, right? Because the soul is God creates the souls, and they exist irrespective of the body, and then they come associate with the body and then dissociate from it. Whereas it seems that most Christians think that the soul comes into being with the body or around the same time, and then that raises then the question: well, then if the body is extinguished or destroyed, well, couldn't the soul also? Like, if it comes into being with the body, then wouldn't it go out of being with the body? But apparently it doesn't. Like, that's just not how it works. I guess God can do what he wants, right? But again, it just seems more and more ad hoc. Like, well, why would it not work so that you actually die, the soul dies with the body? Braxton says that it doesn't. I don't know that is intel. It just seems to me that he's just hoping you don't think about this and don't ask these questions. Because if you do, I think you just get a whole bundle of nonsense, or just ad hoc assertions. Oh, well, that's just the way it is. Well, I could say that about naturalism. Like, well, any question Braxton asked me, I could just say, well, that's just how it works. But I think maybe I'd have to say that about 3 things. Braxton seems to have to say that about 20 things. And so I think that points to the fact that the naturalist has the simpler view. They may not be able to account for everything, but they have the simpler view. And Braxton can't account for everything either, but he has the more complicated view.
I skipped that you might think causes a problem for our view of consciousness, that God's the best explanation, and that is, does consciousness, are the brain and consciousness related? How is it, if our soul is our consciousness, that when we affect the brain, we affect consciousness with medications or injuries? Well, we don't think that the brain is unimportant. Believers think that God has designed the human body in an incredible way and that it has function and purpose. The brain, as I said before, is like a computer that serves up the facts, and then in your conscious experience, you make decisions based on those. And here's what I want you to get from this. When we think about what that's like in your brain, it's kind of like your brain is the hardware. It's like an AM/FM radio, if you remember AM/FM radio.
So this is an awful analogy, but I just want to stop there and focus on what he said. So I say because it seems that Braxton's, well, contradicted himself is strong, I realize, but at the very least, I think he's run into a whole bunch of problems here. First of all, he says that the brain is very important. God made it that way. Well, apparently not, right? Because you can do without it. Like, you can be conscious without the brain. Apparently in heaven, at least sometimes, you don't need a body based on the near-death experiences that Braxton was talking about, or even if you're not in heaven. So if near-death experiences are a thing, you don't need a body to be conscious. So why did God make one? Like, what's the point of it? he just really likes it for some reason. This is an obvious question. If you don't actually need it, then why do we have it? But also, how can you say it's important, but also it's not important? It's not important because you can be conscious without it. Your mind can operate perfectly fine without one, according to Braxton. You can perceive things, you can remember things, you can think about things, all without a brain, according to Braxton. But at the same time, you need a brain because your brain serves up the data. What? How is it both? Like, what am I not the only one who's seeing that he wants to eat his cake and have it too? He wants to say the brain is important, but also except when it isn't. Like, how does that make the slightest bit of sense? Now, the other thing that he says is that your soul interacts with your body in some way. I mean, that is a very problematic notion because that violates conservation of energy and momentum and things. The idea that there's something outside of the material world that has causal effects on things within the material world. I don't think that dualists have produced a satisfactory answer to this question. I think the best answer is simply that it does, but we can't detect it because it happens in subtle ways. But I think that is extremely implausible and rather a cop-out. I think it's physically impossible for the soul to interact with the brain in the way that Braxton seems to think that it does. It's interactionist dualism. There's just no way that a soul can move neurons around. I mean, not physically move them around, but like change their firing activities, which is what it would have to do. Excuse me. Oh dear. To have the effects that Braxton wants it to, like to process the data or whatever the soul's supposed to be doing, to making a choice that then leads us to move our muscles around. The soul has to somehow change the concentration of ions in different parts of the brain. Now, how does it do that? How does the soul do that, Braxton? You want me to, as a naturalist, to explain how the brain gives rise to consciousness. If I have to answer a how question, you, Braxton, have to answer a how question. How does the soul change ion concentrations in the brain? I would like an answer to that. And if you don't have an answer to that, which I know you don't, and it's okay for you just to say, well, it does, and we don't really know how, but it's just sort of how it works, then it's okay for me to say, well, the brain just does produce conscious experiences and we don't really know how, but that's just how it works. I think there's a symmetry here, right? This is a how question. So if I need to answer a how question, Braxton needs to answer this how question. If he doesn't, then I don't. So again, I think that this notion of interaction becomes massively problematic on its own terms. Plus then, if you want to say, but actually they don't need to interact, because then sometimes the soul doesn't actually need the body. But then sometimes the body can affect the soul as well. So somehow neurons can actually have an effect on the soul. Good luck figuring out how that works. Why only neurons? Why can't other things affect souls? Can rocks affect souls? Like, can a rock have a soul? Because you know what? I'm just going to keep playing, because I'm just going to get more confused if I ask these questions.
Yes, they still exist. That's like your brain. It's the hardware, and a signal or a song plays through that FM radio. But if you damage the radio, the song isn't going to sound right, is it? It's going to come through distorted or in some other way different. But you didn't affect the song. You didn't damage the music. You just damaged the hardware. Now, in this similar way, if you damage your brain or if you affect your brain with medication, your consciousness may be a little different, but you didn't destroy the beautiful music of your soul that comes through the hardware of your brain. Those are distinct, although they are related. So I submit to you the best explanation.
So Braxton says that if you damage your brain, then the consciousness sort of can't come through properly. But if you destroy your brain, like if it's dead or at least non-functioning, then the consciousness can come through because of near-death experiences, right? Can someone explain to me how that makes the slightest bit of sense? Why does it sometimes need the body, but then sometimes it doesn't? Also, if your soul is conscious all by itself, then when part of your brain is damaged, why would that sort of eliminate the consciousness? Wouldn't it be more like a speech impediment, right? Well, at least I suppose some type of speech impediments. Like, you know what you want to say, you have a clear idea of it, or even when you just can't find the word, like, but you just sort of can't get it out. Or if your muscle is sore, or you have paralysis problems, like you know exactly what you want to do, but you just can't sort of make it happen. Wouldn't it be more like that? Like your consciousness is still fully there, but your body just won't cooperate, kind of thing. But that's not, as far as we can tell, how these work. Like Phineas Gage, he wasn't the same person who couldn't get his body to cooperate. Like, he was changed, his personality was changed, or memories can be lost. Or memories can be, in fact, produced or induced. At least in animals, this has been done, but you can also elicit particular sensations by activating particular regions of the brain using transcranial magnetic stimulation. There's all sorts of different things we can do these days. And I don't know that this makes the slightest bit of sense if those things are somehow involved with the soul. Like, that the soul would be its own thing. And why would poking bits of the brain have any bearing on the soul? It's like that when your brain malfunctions, it kind of covers up functions of the soul, or the soul doesn't work properly. But then if it frees itself from the body, then it works properly fine, and you can see things and go to heaven or whatever. Like, that's just really weird and ad hoc. Why would it work that way? How is the brain and the soul interacting again? And why does the soul need the body, but sometimes doesn't? It doesn't make any sense. We have so much knowledge about how the brain works, right? Because people spend decades trying to understand these questions, and we have a lot more that we need to learn. The most trivial questions that you can ask about how souls are supposed to work, I don't think Braxton or anyone else has the remotest idea how to answer these questions, or what methodologies to use, or what experiments to conduct, or what theories would be relevant, or what to compute, what statistical tests to conduct. There's no methodology here. There's no theory here. There's nothing here. It's vacuous. It's platitudes that appeal to folk psychological notions about, there's something immaterial about us, and the notion of going to heaven and things like that. It's trying to make it seem like there's a theory when there isn't. And I just don't see how there's any explanatory value to any of this at all. I might as well just say it does in terms of, well, why does it work that way? It just does. And that's a better explanation than what Braxton has to say. Because basically what Braxton has is complicated woo stuff. And then if you ask why one more time, it just does. It just all works that way for reasons. Well, I might as well just say it just works that way and not postulate all the woo weird stuff. At least we've got a neuroscience that's starting to answer these questions. We don't have any soul science that's even remotely able to answer any question. And that's despite the fact that neuroscience, depending on how you date things, is only about 50-ish years old. It's the Society of Neuroscience founded in 1970. The notion of a Cartesian dualist soul is hundreds of years old. And I'd say we've made essentially no progress there. So, I mean, you can see how I'm extremely critical of this notion of interaction of substance dualism, especially when it comes in the near-death experience variety, because that adds additional absurdity to it. The notion that it explains anything, I think, is ridiculous. Not only that, but Braxton wants to say that actually God has something to do with any of this, where I just don't see how God fits into this at all. I mean, God could create souls, but he could not create souls. Like, well, how does God even relate to this? Why does God need souls to work in this way? Why is it that if I just postulate God, you're immediately going to think, yes, we're going to have souls that work in this bizarre way? Why? Or how does that follow from God? How does that even follow from Christianity? If anything follows from Christianity, it would seem to be that you need a body, because what happened to Jesus when he died? He didn't say, hey, look, guys, I've been freed from the bodily form. In fact, this was a heresy, right? If people have said this. Turns out you don't need one, right? You can just be a soul and experience things and go to heaven or whatever. No, actually, the whole point of Christianity is that he was risen, right? His body was restored, or, glorified state or whatever. I know there's angels and other things as well in Christian theology, but the very basic point that it seems fundamental to Christian theology that the physicality of the body is important, right? Plus, the incarnation being important as well. So if anything, the point I'm making is, if anything, you might say that actually Christianity, like God as in Christian theology, you'd not predict that you'd have a soul that works like this. It seems to me, if anything. But really, God could do anything, right? So why would you expect it to work this way? I just think that there's no explanation here. I've talked about this quite a lot, but if your explanation seems to be equally consistent with all possible facts, or almost all of them, then there's no explanation there. Like, you haven't said why we got this and not something else. You've just given a story, essentially, that doesn't actually have an explanatory value. So I just don't think there's any explanation to be had here, not with souls and certainly not with God.
Explanation for your conscious experience is that there is a conscious creator who created you with this ability to have free will and make real meaningful decisions, moral decisions, important decisions. You have imagination so that you can think about a beautiful song and write it, or a sculpture and make it, or what you're going to eat and then fix it. You can love because love is real and important, and you can choose to freely give of yourself for the good of another. These things are all possible because of this incredible ability that God gave you to experience the amazing world he made, your consciousness, your soul. And the most important thing, and here's where I will just maybe say some things that sound a little preacher-like. If that's true, then the most important thing you could do with your conscious experience is choose to give it all to Jesus, to serve him. Now, I haven't said anything about Jesus. You might say, well, you've given me good reasons to believe maybe that there's a soul.
Yeah, which I also thought was extremely weird. Now, I didn't listen to the songs. I think they were mostly about, like, what he was talking about, though. So at this point, we're 50 minutes into a sermon / I don't know, worship, whatever they call these things. And, like, Jesus has barely been mentioned. Which I just think is bizarre for a Christian church. I mean, I suppose that I missed the first 10 minutes or so maybe they talked about him a lot then, and maybe there's something before this, although I don't know, I suspect these things aren't that long. Anyway, I just feel like if it's a Christian church, you should kind of be talking about Jesus a little more than as an afterthought at the end. I guess Christians aren't going to listen to me about how they should conduct their worship, but I just found this a bit odd. Like, what does this have to do with Christianity? This seems to be more like, Greek philosophy, not, which I think is where this has come from. I don't think Paul would have been really that interested in this.
And maybe God and maybe an afterlife, but how do I know that it's the Christian one? Well, real quickly, I'll just say this. I don't have time for another presentation, and this church has done a presentation on this before, but if you don't believe in the resurrection, I'll tell you what, I understand it sounds wild to people, but I want you to realize this. When we're talking about the facts around the life and death of Jesus, there are a few facts that historians, whether they're Christian, atheist, or whatever in between,
talking about this
at accredited schools and universities all over the Western world, universally agree about historically. That is that, number one, there was a Jesus, that he thought of himself as God's agent to bring about the kingdom on earth, that it was going to turn the world upside down, this message. They believe that he died by Roman crucifixion under the prefect Pontius Pilate, just like the Bible says. They believe that that after his death, his earliest followers had experiences that they at least interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus. And that they were so committed to this new faith, this claim about the resurrection, that they were willing to be persecuted and die for it, and some of them did die. So here's what I want to say to you. If God exists and God raised Jesus from the dead, if that's true, if that's a historical fact, then it means that it's very, very important. And it means that there's hope. There's hope for you. You know, the Bible tells us in Romans chapter 10 and verse 9 that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, you will be saved. John 3:16 tells us, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. The most important thing consciously you can do today is give it all to Jesus, or at least decide to think about these things in greater detail, because there's hope. You know, for some of you, I don't want you to raise your hand, but you've lost someone's died who you love, and they were a Christian. And some days you'll walk around the house and you'll see a picture of them and it won't be that big of a deal, but then other days you'll see that picture and you just cry all day long. Or some place in the community that used to be a special place for the two of you. And on Thanksgiving, maybe someone else is sitting in the chair they always sat in, but as far as you're concerned, that's their chair. You know what that's like? There's hope. There's hope. The evidence suggests there's hope that you can see them again. You can see them again. And I hope that you will make this decision today to give it all to Jesus. Because if your consciousness survives from one cell to the next as your body changes, and if you can remain conscious even after the brain stops functioning, you can remain conscious even after the death of your body. I would ask all of you all to do something with me right now. Just think about this for a moment while I'm going to pray. We believe as Christians that our consciousness, part of what's amazing about it, is we have this consciousness and God is conscious, and we can consciously interact with our God in prayer. We're going to do that right now, and perhaps it's your moment to pray to the God that you might not even believe in and ask him to reveal himself to you. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for all that you give us.
I wonder how many people in the audience aren't Christians. The way Braxton talks is as if it's quite a large number. I have no idea. I just think that's interesting. Yeah, I just think it's weird that it's sort of, well, we got a few Bible verses dropped in the last 2 minutes. And what was that minimal facts in 2 minutes that we had there? I find that just so strange. Where in the New Testament do we get anything? I mean, yeah, they want to persuade us in the New Testament that, Jesus did rise and so forth. So obviously they're trying to persuade. But when do they talk about historical facts or minimal facts or anything like that? That's not that's not what they're doing there. And I wonder if that's why people come to this church. I mean, maybe it is, I don't know. But it's more just like who is that for? Is it for the believer? Because the believer already believes this stuff, right? I mean, why would telling them in this really weird way that I don't think connects with many people's faith, at least not in my experience, why would that impact them or change much of anything? But if it's for the non-believer, well, I mean, how would that be persuasive? That's not in the slightest bit persuasive. Again, maybe it's just supposed to get them to think about it. I just think that's really weird. I hadn't watched that very last bit, so I'm just responding to that kind of now. I'm just a bit surprised. I thought he was going to make some more sort of theological points, and he kind of did, right? But they were just sort of more apologetics, and then and follow Jesus, and there was almost no substance to that. I just found it very just weird. I don't know what else to say about it, and just really unattractive in the sense of why would you, why would I want to be part of something like this that throws this philosophy and apologetic stuff in your face, and then doesn't. I mean, I'm not saying they do this every week, right? Although apparently they have had similar things to this from what Braxton said. So it's just strange. Anyway, so that was why God explains consciousness. So let's just review a little bit there. Braxton actually said almost nothing about God. The way that God explains consciousness is apparently because he made consciousness, which is odd because God's supposed to have made everything except himself, I guess. So which actually is interesting, because if God is conscious and God didn't make himself, then God didn't make consciousness. He made, I guess, human consciousnesses, presumably, but not all consciousnesses. But that's a bit frivolous, right? Because God's supposed to create everything that is created. So that doesn't seem like as much of an explanation. I guess you could ask, why did God create consciousness, or why did God create consciousness that's embodied? We didn't get any answers to that. So God just feels like a red herring here. Almost all of what Braxton was actually arguing for was arguments against materialism, saying that consciousness has to transcend the material world. And we had arguments like Mary, the colorblind neuroscientist, and arguments about the continuity of personhood over time and how to ground that in physicalism. And he mentioned near-death experiences as alleged evidence for the survival of the mind, or something after death. But as I talked about, I don't really find any of these arguments or evidences persuasive. And look, even if they were kind of persuasive against naturalism, the issue is that Braxton has no better alternative to explain any of these things. Braxton can't explain how the soul produces or is or whatever a conscious experience. He just says that it does. Well, actually, he didn't address this at all. I'm assuming that that's what he would say. And if he can say that it does, well, why can't I just say the brain does? I think we have more evidence for that than we do for souls. Remember how he poo-pooed the idea that there is about panpsychism, that everything is conscious because there's no evidence for it. It's just a speculation. Well, what's the evidence for souls? Right? I guess Braxton would say neither experience is the evidence for souls, but how, like, couldn't that just be evidence for panpsychism just as much? I'm not quite sure how that's evidence for souls specifically. Maybe it depends on the content of that experience. I don't know, but yeah, so anyway, I think we've got more evidence in favor of the idea that brains cause consciousness than souls cause consciousness. We don't know the how, but remember, how is different to why. Braxton might have a why answer to souls and consciousness, but he doesn't have a how answer. And that's what he's asking the materialist. So I think that we need to be consistent with standards here. With respect to the issue of the continuity of personhood over time, Braxton has an answer to this about the existence of the soul, which kind of addresses the issue, although only in the case of persons, not any other material object. So I think that he still has to face the issue there. And the question would be, why give a different answer in one case than the other case? Why not just give a consistent answer, which is the way I would adopt? Then there are further issues such as, do animals have souls? And if so, which animals? And how many different types of souls are there? When does the soul enter the human body? How is the soul associated with one human body and not others? And how is a non-material thing localized in space and time? That doesn't really make sense. How does the soul interact with the body such that it affects the body and the body affects it? Does that not violate conservation of angular momentum and energy and things? Should we not actually be able to detect that experimentally? Why do souls only associate, it seems, with brains of sufficiently high complexity? Like, why is there a necessity connection there? Couldn't they associate with other things as well? Why did God make souls in the first place if bodies can just be conscious by themselves? Like, couldn't God make it that way? If God couldn't make it that way, then why bother with bodies? Why not just go with souls? So there's a whole host of questions that are raised here that I think are just big problems for Braxton's view there. And then the final issue about the near-death experiences, that seems to contradict almost everything that Braxton says about the fact that brains are necessary for a consciousness. They're not sufficient, perhaps. You need the soul as well. But Braxton says brains matter, except when they don't, except when they're dead or nearly dead. Then apparently your soul can just float off and go to heaven, maybe, but you didn't commit to that, and have all these experiences and remember things and have perceptions, which apparently you need the brain to do, but then they can happen without the brain, which just doesn't make the slightest bit of sense. So I think that even if Braxton's arguments against materialism succeed, which I don't think they do, as I argued, Braxton does not have a better alternative. His alternative of some sort of interaction of substance dualism with near-death experiences as a bonus on the side is completely incoherent and doesn't make the slightest bit of sense. Is basically pseudoscientific and medieval in sort of a superstitious, derogatory sense of it, and is borrowing a lot more, as I sort of mentioned, from, I think, Platonic philosophy than it is from Christianity, because I think, again, a sort of at least a superficial read of, say, the Gospels indicates that bodies are actually really important, because, you know, when Jesus came back, he had his body, and that was kind of the whole point of the thing, right? The resurrection. He didn't come back as a disembodied soul and tell everyone about how consciousness transcends the material. No, he came back as a body that you could touch and like could eat. So I don't even know theologically how this fits in. So that's my response to this video. As I said, I thought it was bad. I thought the arguments were bad, even for a sermon. And more to the point, the application of sort of his own theory, I think uncritically and without really addressing any of these sorts of issues, was also pretty bad. And just, I don't know, just from a Christian point of view, I thought it was kind of just really lacking in the actual Christian content. But I suppose that one is maybe outside of my expertise. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Hopefully you found that somewhat interesting. I am, as usual, a bit over time. I wanted this to be a little shorter, but that's how things go. Yeah, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I don't know when we're going to be doing the next Bad Apologetics with Nathan, because he's busy with stuff. So that might be a little while in coming, but I'll see if, you know, I keep an eye out for these sort of videos and try to respond to one when it tickles my fancy. And feel free to send me suggestions if you think that there's something that would be worthwhile responding to. So thanks, everyone. Stay safe. Talk to you next time. Bye.